70% of Ethiopia's problems will be solved ይልና ይሄንን ያለው implying that he may stop delivery of international food aid altogether እና ምን ያህል biased እንደሆነ ህጉ እንድታዩት ብዬ ነው እናቀም ሰጣችሁ የአብይ ኢትዮጵያ ውስጥ ስንዴ ማስገባት ብናቆም ችግራችን 70% ችግራችን ይቀርፋል ብሎ ያለው ኢትዮጵያ ውስጥ የኢንተርናሽናል እርዳታ ጨርሶ እንዳይገባ የማድረግ አላማ ስላለው ብሎ ነው የጻፉት so በጣም one sided የሆነ misguided የሆነ ሪያሊቲውን ካፕቸር የማያደርግ መሰረት ይዞ የተነሳ ህግ መሆኑን ለማሳየት ነው ይሄንን የምጠቅሰው በመጨረሻ እንደዛም አንድ እዚህ ላይ ማሳያችሁ የኢትዮጵያ ገቨርንመንት ማንኛውንም የዲፕሎማቲክ ሶሉሽኖች እንቢ ብሏል በአፍሪካ ዩኒየን የመጣውንም በኢጋድም የመጣውንም በሌላም ቦታ የመጣውንም እንቢ ብሏል ነው የኢትዮጵያ መንግስት 3 ጊዜ የተኩስ ማቆም ትዕዛዝ ዩኒላተራልም ቢሆን እንዳደረገ የጥሞና ጊዜ ብሎ ጦርነትን ጦር ሰራዊት አውጥቶ ከትግራይ የተወሰነ ጊዜ ሰው የሚረስ ምናምን ብሎ ያለውንም አልተጠቀሱትም ከዛም በኋላ በተለያየ ጊዜ የተደረገውን አፋር ላይ አማራ ኤሪያ የደረሰውን ኃይለኛ ጥቃትና ውድመት ያውም ሆን ተብሎ የተደረገውን ማለት በጦርነት መሃል የሚደርሱ ነገሮች አሉ ነገር ግን ሆን ተብሎ ደግሞ የተደረጉ ኃይለኛ የሰብአዊ መብት ጥሰቶችና የኢንፍራስትራክቸር ውድመቶች ዝርፊያዎች እነዛ በሙሉ አልተጠቀሱም ስለዚህ ይሄ ነገር ይሄ ህግ አላማውን ከፕሬሚሱ ወይም ደግሞ ከመሰረቱ ለመረዳት ይቻላል አላማው ኢትዮጵያ ውስጥ ሰላም ለማምጣት አይደለም አላማው ኢትዮጵያ ውስጥ ያለውን ጦርነት ለማቆም አይደለም አላማው ትግራይ ውስጥ ምግብ እንዲገባ ወይ እንደዚህ ስፔሲፊክሊ ወጣ አይደለም አላማው መንግስትን ማውረድ የቲፒኤል ደጋፊ ስፖንሰር የሚያደርገው ላቢ አድቮኬሲ እነሱ የሚያረጉትን የተለያየ ፍላጎት ማሟላት ምክንያቱም በኋላ እንደምናየው ይሄ ህግ ከአድቮኬሲ የመጣ ህግ ነው ከአድቮኬሲ የመጣ ህግ ነው ማለት ስፖንሰርድ የሆነ ህግ ነው ስፖንሰርድ የሆነው ደግሞ በጣም በተቀናበረ ካምፔን በገንዘብ እርዳታ እና በአድቮኬሲ የመጣ ህግ ስለሆነ አካሄዱን ወደፊት መመርመር እና ለመገመት ምንችለው ይሄንን ህግ ያመጡት ግሩፖች በሚፈልጉት መልክ የሚሄድ ህግ ነው አተረጓጎም ላይ በሚመጣበት ጊዜ መሬት ላይ ያለው ነገር የሚተረጎመው በትክክለኛው ኢንፎርሜሽን ሳይሆን ይሄንን ህግ ስፖንሰር ያደረጉት ሰዎች በሚፈልጉት መርጠው በሚጠቀሙበት ኢንፎርሜሽን መሰረት ያ ኢምፖርታንት ምንድነው የሚያደርገው ህጉ ምን ይላል ኢትዮጵያ ላይ በአራት ሴክተሮች ላይ ኃይለኛ ቁጥጥር ማዕቀብ እንዲሁም ሞኒተሪንግ ኮንትሮል ኤንድ ሞኒተር የሚያደርግ ህግ መቆጣጠር ሂደቱን መከታተል የሚያስችሉ ህጎችን ነው የሚያወጣው እንዴት ነው የሚቆጣጠረው እንዴት ነው የሚከታተለው ሚሊተሪን በተመለከተ ማንኛውም መሳሪያ የውጊያም ይሁን ወታደር ሊጠቀምበት የሚችለው ማንኛውም ቁሳቁስ ለወታደር ወይም ደግሞ ለጦር መሳሪያ ሊውሉ የሚችሉ ማንኛውንም አይነት የሎጂስቲካል የሆነ ብርድ ልብስም ሊሆን ይችላል ልብስም ሊሆን ይችላል ጥይትም ሊሆን ይችላል መኪና መለዋወጫም ሊሆን ይችላል የቴክኒካል እንትንም ሊሆን ይችላል የኮምፒውተር ሰርቪሶችንም ሊሆን ይችላል ማንኛውም ነገር ኢትዮጵያ መንግስት መግዛት እንዳይችል ከውጭ ያደርጋል ይሄን የሚያደርገው ኢትዮጵያ መንግስት የተባለውን ነገር የማያደርግ ከሆነ ማለት ነው የተባለው ነገር ደግሞ ምንድናቸው የሚለው እናዋለን ሌላው ከዛ ጋር የተገናኙ ከሚሊተሪ ከመደበኛ የጦር መሳሪያ ማለት ማንኛውም ነፍስ ወከፍ መሳሪያ ጥይትን ሁሉንም ጨምሮ ማለት ነው ለኢትዮጵያ መንግስት የሚሸጥ ማንኛውም ግለሰብም ሆነ ከመንግስት ጋር የተገናኙ ድርጅቶች ወይም የግል ድርጅቶች ከሚሸጥ መንግስት ጋር የሚሰሩ ወይም መንግስት ውስጥ የሚሰሩ የመንግስት ባለስልጣኖች የተለያዩ ሀገሮች ማዕቀብ ይጣልባቸው ያ ማለት ማንኛውም ሰው ያንን ፈርቶ ከኢትዮጵያ መንግስት ጋር ምንም አይነት ሚሊተሪ ዲል እንዳያደርግ ለማድረግ የኢኮኖሚው ላይ የኢትዮጵያ መንግስት ከውጭ ሀገር ኢንተርናሽናል ድርጅቶች ምንም አይነት ብድር እንዳያገኝ ክሬዲት ኤክስቴንድ እንዳያስደርግ የተለያዩ ፋይናንሻል እርዳታዎች እንዳያገኝ የአሜሪካንን ድምጽ በመጠቀም ያንን አይነት ጥያቄው ውድቅ እንዲሆን የሚያደርግ ሌላ ኢኮኖሚ ሳንክሽን የሚጥል ህግ ነው የንግግሮች ላይ ደግሞ ማንኛውም ኢትዮጵያዊ ከውጭ ሆኖ ወይም ሌላ ሀገር ግለሰብ በኢትዮጵያ ጉዳይ ላይ የሚናገራቸውን ነገሮች ኮንትሮል ማድረግ ሊሚት ማድረግ እንዲያስችል ከሶሻል ሚዲያዎች ጋር ተነጋግሮ ገደብ የሚያስደርግ ህግ ነው ሶስተኛ የህግ ፕሮሰሱን ደግሞ ኢትዮጵያ ያለውን የህግ ፕሮሰስ በተወሰነ ደረጃ የአሜሪካ መንግስት መከሰስ አለባቸው ብለው የሚያስባቸው ግለሰቦች ካልተከሰሱ እነዚህ የተመደቡት ወርኪንግ ግሩፕ ያልኳችሁ ቅድም በስቴት ዲፓርትመንት ስር የሚሰሩት ከዩኤስኤድ ከተለያዩ የአሜሪካ የፌደራል ኤጀንሲ የተውጣጡ ሰዎች በሚስማማቸው መሰረት የኢትዮጵያ መንግስት ወይም ደግሞ የኢንተርናሽናል የተመደበ አንድ የጁዲሻል ባዲ መከሰስ አለባቸው ተብሎ ያሏቸውን ሰዎች የማይከሱ ከሆነ ወይም የሚያስፈልገውን ቅጣት የማይሰጡ ከሆነ ያንን እየተከታተሉ ለአሜሪካ ኮንግረስ እያቀረቡ በአሜሪካ ኮንግረስ እየታየ አይ ይሄ የሚያደርገው ትክክል ነው ይሄ ደግሞ ትክክል አይደለም እየተባለ ማዕቀቡ የሚቀጥልበት ስርዓት የሚያስቀምጥ እነዚህ ሳንክሽኖች ማን ላይ ነው እንዴት ነው ሊመጡ የሚችሉት በሚለው ጊዜ ማንኛውም ሰው ሲስፋየር ወይም የተኩስ ማቆም ስምምነት ወይም ደግሞ የጦርነቱን ማቆም ፕሮሰስ ካጨናገፈ ማንኛውም ፖሊሲ አውጥቶ ወይም ደግሞ ዳይሬክቲቭ አውጥቶ የሲቪል ወሩን ወይም የእርስ በርስ ግጭቱን ኤክስፓንድ የሚያደርግ ከሆነ የሁማኒቴሪያን እርዳታ ወይም ምግብ አክሰስ የሚያጨናግፍ ሰው ካለ እነዚህ ነገሮች ሳንክሽን ኢትዮጵያ ላይ ሊያስመጡ የሚችሉ ናቸው እስካሁን ያልኳቸው እንዲሁ ካሰባችሁት መጥፎ ላይ መስል ይችላል ነገር ግን በዛ አቆመ ለምሳሌ ምን ይላል ማንኛውም ሰው ወይም መንግስትም ሊሆን ይችላል knowingly engaged in materially contributed to the civil war ለምሳሌ አንድ ቦታ ላይ የተወሰነ ትንኩሻ ኖሮ መንግስት ጦር ልኮ እዛ ያንን በሚከላከልበት ጊዜ የተነኮሰው አይኔ ምንም ሳላደርግ ነው የተወረርኩት ወይም ደግሞ ጥቃት የደረሰብኝ ካለ ያንን ይሄንን ፕሮቪዥን መንግስት ጥሷል ሆን ብሎ ሲቪል ወሩን ኤክስፓንድ አድርጓል ለዛ ደግሞ ለተላከው ጦር እንዲህ አይነት ነገር እንዲደርስ እንደዚህ ደግሞ ያደረጉ እንትኖች አሉ ለምሳሌ አንድ ስቴት ክልል ወይም ረድቶ ከሆነ የፌደራሉን ጦር ያን ክልል ሌላ ማዕቀብ ውስጥ ሊገባ ይችላል ማለት ነው እና ማንኛውም እርዳታ የሰጠ ሁለተኛ ደግሞ any technical training financial resource ወይም service ለኢትዮጵያ መንግስት ምክር አድቫይስ እንደገና ኤኒ እቃ ሳፕላዮች ሽያጭ ወይም ደግሞ በቅያሬም ቢሆን የሆነ ነገር ካስተላለፉ ለኢትዮጵያ መንግስት ሳንክሽን ሊደረጉ ይችላሉ ስፔር ፓርት ጭምር የመኪና ስፔር ፓርት ሊሆን ይችላል የመሳሪያ ስፔር ፓርት ሊሆን ይችላል በተጨማሪ ደግሞ ዱዋል ዩስ ያላቸው የሚሏቸው ነገሮች አሉ ዱዋል ዩስ ማለት ለምሳሌ አንድ እቃ ለሶሪ ወደ ኋላ ልመለስ አንድ እቃ ለጦር መሳሪያም ሊሆን ይችላል ለሰላማዊም ሊሆን ይችላል ለሰላማዊ ለምሳሌ የሚጠቀምበት መንግስት የመኪና መለዋወጫዎች ሊሆኑ ይችላሉ ለወታደር ማመላለሻ ትራኮችን ሊሆኑ ስለሚችሉ እነሱን መሸጥ እንኳን ችግር ውስጥ ሊገባ ይችላል እነሱን ማስመጣት መንግስት ስለዚህ ይሄ ዱዋል ዩስ የሚለው ፕሮቪዥን እዚህ ውስጥ የገባው ምንድነው ብዙ ጊዜ እንዲህ አይነት ዱዋል ዩስ አሁን ኢራን ውስጥ ይሄ ራሱ ፕሮቪዥን ትልቅ ፕሮብሌም አንጥቶ ነበር ኢቭን የሜዲካል ሳፕላዮች ዱዋል ዩስ ሊሆኑ ይችላሉ ጦርነት በሚካሄድበት ጊዜ መንግስት የሚያስመጣቸው የሜዲካል እቃዎች ወታደሩን የተጎዳውን ወታደር ለማከም ሊጠቀምባት ይችላል ስለዚህ ያም ሊገናኝ ይችላል ዋናው ግን ምንድነው ተገናኘም አልተገናኘም የሚሸጠው ድርጅት ይሄ ሳንክሽን እንዲገባበት አይፈልግም ስለዚህ ለምን ብሎ ከመንግስት ጋር ድርድር ውስጥ ገብቶ እንዲህ አይነት ነገር ለምን ይሸጣል አይሸጥም ለኢትዮጵያ ይሄ ሳንክሽን በመፍራት ማለት ነው ስለዚህ ምንድነው ኢፌክቱ ሰስፔንድ ሎን ሰስፔንድ በሚሆንበት ጊዜ ክሬዲት ሰስፔንድ ኤክስቴንድ በማይደረግበት ጊዜ እርዳታ የቴክኒካልም ሆነ የሴኩሪቲ ወይም ደግሞ የሌላ አይነት እርዳታ በማይሰጥበት ጊዜ ምንድነው ሀፕን የሚያደርገው ምን ይላል ህጉ የአሜሪካ መንግስት ባለው ድምጽ ተጠቅሞ ሎን ኤድ እንዳይኖር እርዳታ እንዳይኖር ብድር እንዳይኖር ብድር ደግሞ ክሬዲት ደግሞ ኤክስቴንድ እንዳይደረግ ለኢትዮጵያ መንግስት ያደርጋል ይላል ሴኩሪቲ አሲስታንስ ያቆማል እና በተጨማሪ ደግሞ የኢትዮጵያና የኤርትራ ፋይናንሻል ኢንስቲትዩቶች ከመንግስት ጋር ሆነው ውጪም ያሉ ማንኛውም አይነት ቴክኒካል ኢኩዊፕመንት ወይም ደግሞ ከመሳሪያም ጋር የተገናኘ ወይም ደግሞ በሌላ ሶስተኛ ሰው በኩል ለሄዶ በማንኛውም መልኩ ወደ ጦርነት ወይም ደግሞ ወደ ግጭቶች አካባቢ የሚሄድ እርዳታ ቁስም ሆነ ምናምን ፋሲሊቴት የሚያደርግ የፋይናንሻል ኢንስቲትዩሽን አይደንቲፋይ ተደርጎ እሱም ሳንክሽን ውስጥ ይገባል ስለሚል ፋይናንሻል ኢንስቲትዩሽኖች ከኢትዮጵያ መንግስት ጋር ዲል ማድረግ ይፈራሉ ማለት ነው አንድ ግለሰብ እንኳን የሆነ እቃ ወደ ኢትዮጵያ ለመላክ ቢሞክር ይሄ እቃ ወዴት ይሄዳል ለምንድነው ወዴት አካባቢ ነው የሚላከው ለምን ጥቅም ነው የሚውለው የሚለውን ጥያቄ አጣርተው 100% ክሊር ከሆኑ በኋላ ነው ያንን ሊሰሩ የሚችሉት ያ ደግሞ ትልቅ አድሚኒስትሬቲቭ እና አዲሽናል ኮስት ስለሚጨምርባቸው የሚያገኙትም ጥቅም በጣም አነስተኛ ስለሚሆን በቀላሉ የሚያደርጉት ምንድነው የኢትዮጵያ ጋር የተገናኘ ነገር አንሰራም ትራንስፈር አናደርግም ብለው ወደ ጎን ማድረግ ይቀላቸዋል እነዚህ ነገሮች ምንድነው የሚያመጡት ትልቅ የፎሬን ከረንሲ ሾርቴጅ ያመጣሉ የፎሬን ከረንሲ ኢትዮጵያ በጣም ከፍተኛ ችግር ያለባት ሀገር ናት ፎሬን ከረንሲ በባጀቷ ዲፔንድ ያደርጋል በሎን እና በክሬዲት ፎሬን ከረንሲ በማይኖርበት ጊዜ መንግስት ያለው ገንዘብ በጣም ቫልዩን ያጣል ቫሊዩን በሚያጣ ጊዜ መንግስት ፕሮቫይድ የሚያደርጋቸው የተለያዩ ሰርቪሶችን መክፈል ያቅተዋል። ከውጭ የሚያስመጣቸው እቃዎች ለተለያየ ሴክተር የሚያስፈልጉ እቃዎች በጣም ይወደዳሉ። እነሱንም ማስመጣት
ደረጃ hate to do this to you ትንሽ አሳጥረው it's very important ለዚህ ነው የለቀቁ እንትን ያልከው
በጣም
ትንሽ I'll give you 2 more minutes okay
so budget ኃይለኛ ኮንስትሬንት ይኖራል። ፔንሽን መክፈል አይችልም መንግስት። ሄልት ኬር ላይ ፋርማሲቲካል ኢኩዊፕመንቶችን ሜዲካል ኢኩዊፕመንቶችን ማምጣት አይችልም። አግሪካልቸር ኢቭን ማዳበሪያ እንኳን ማስመጣት አይችልም። ብዙ ሀገሮች ማዳበሪያ ለምሳሌ ለኬሚካል ዌፐን ይጠቀማሉ እየተባለ በማዳበሪያ ራሱ በጣም አስቸጋሪ ነው ከሚሊተሪ ጋር ለማገናኘት። ኤጁኬሽን ኢንፍራስትራክቸር የምግብ ዋጋ በጣም ይንራል የፎሬን ካረንሲ ስለማይኖር። ምግብ የሚዘዋወረው በጋዝ ነው። መኪኖች ያስፈልጋሉ። ጋዝ ለማምጣት ፎሬን ካረንሲ ያስፈልጋል እና አንኤምፕሎይመንት በጣም እንደሚጨምር ምንም ጥርጥር አይኖረውም። ከዚህም ሀገር ሆነው ደግሞ ክሬዲት ካርድ መጠቀም ወይም ኢትዮጵያ ያሉ የተለያዩ ነገሮችን ትራንዛክሽን ለማድረግ የሚፈልጉ ኢትዮጵያኖች ያንን ማድረግ አይችሉም። ኢትዮጵያ ውስጥ ያሉ ሰዎች ትሬድ ለማድረግ ከውጭ ሀገር የውጭ ካረንሲ ያኖራቸውም ኢምፖርት ማድረግ አይቻልም። አጓ የሚባለው ይመለሳል የሚለውን ፎርጌት አይመለስም በዚህ ይሄ ህግ ካለፈ እና ይሄ ኢትዮጵያና ኤርትራ ላይ ነው ፎከስ የሚያደርገው። ለሚቀጥለው 10 አመት በየ6 ወሩ የኢትዮጵያ ፕሮግሬስ እየታየ በአሜሪካ ኮንግረስ ይሄ ህግ በ30 ቀን ወይም ምናምን እየተጨመረ እየታየ በአሜሪካ ኮንግረስ ቁጥጥር ስር ኢትዮጵያ ለሚቀጥለው 10 አመት ትቀጥላለች እና ይሄ እዚህ የደረስነው ኃይለኛ ኮኦርዲኔትድ አድቮኬሲ ተደርጎ ነው። አሁን ይሄንን ከሜሮን ካወጣችሁ ላይ ነው ተበድሬ ማሳያችሁ። ይሄንን ህግ ፕሮፖዝ ያደረገው ሴኔተር መነንደዝ ምን ያህል ገንዘብ ከተለያዩ የኢትዮጵያ ግለሰቦች እንደተቀበለ እዚህ ላይ ማየት ትችላላችሁ እና የተከፈለበት ህግ ነው። ይሄንን ህግ መደገፍ በእኔ አመለካከት ኦልሞስት የሞደርን ዴይ ባንዳ መሆን ማለት ነው። ምክንያቱም የኢትዮጵያ ላይ የመጣ ወረራ ነው። ይሄ የኢትዮጵያን ሉዓላዊነት የሚነካ ወደ ሞደርን ዴይ ቅኝ ግዛት ውስጥ የሚከት እና በጣም አደገኛ የሆነ ዴሞክራሲን የሚያጠፋ ኬዎስ የሚፈጥር ህግ ነው። ሁላችንም ልንቃወመው ይገባናል። ጊዜው ደግሞ አለ። ይሄ ገና ህግ አልሆነም። ከዚህ በኋላ ያለው ፕሮሰስ እስካሁን ካለው የባሰ ከባድ እንጂ ቀላል አይደለም እና ይሄንን ብዬ እዚህ ላይ አቆማለሁ። አመሰግናለሁ።
በጣም አመሰግናለሁ ደረጀ ተኒ ደረጀ። በእውነቱ ላንተ ለብቻህን ጊዜ ማድረግ ያለብን ይመስለኛል። ለዚህ ነው ዝም ብዬ እንትን ያልኩት የለቀኩ because very important information ነው የሰጠህን። ለዚህ ነው አሁን የሚቀጥለው እንትን ፓርቲሲፐንታችን ነብዩ ነው። ግን ሰዓቱን ፕሊዝ ሪስፔክት እያደረጋችሁ እንትን ፕሬዘንት ብታደርጉ ደስ ይለናል። ነብዩ የኢኤዲሲ ሜምበር and chair founder ነብዩ አስፋው።
Right. I'm going to use English if that's okay.
Okay.
So in this Ethiopian conflict, we've witnessed something that we've never seen before in history, and that's virtually the entire Western world governments, institutions have all taken an unusual interest that we've not seen anywhere else in Africa in recent history. From over a dozen UN Security Council hearings to the direct personal engagement of the head of the World Health, to the European Union, the US Congress, State Department, Tier 1 global medias, and even Rights Watch Group are all involved to the lowest detail in Ethiopia's internal affairs, to the point where it's become exhausting just to keep up with who's doing what. So I think for today, I think it's important to connect these dots and look at the bigger picture and see how HR 6600 fits into all this. Because there is a pattern, there has been a pattern to all of it. over the past year, a pattern that has significantly favored the TPLF at the expense of Ethiopia, Eritrea, and the Greater Horn. And it is becoming very clear HR 6600 is a core part of this pattern. And first, I want to set the record straight on what HR 6600 is. And Attorney Dereja has done a fabulous job explaining it, but at the highest level, HR 6600 is a bill. It's not a resolution, and a bill becomes the law of the land. So if passed, it becomes binding and enforceable. It will carry the full weight of the law. Severe consequences that will be imposed on the Ethiopian people for the next decade, essentially putting the Ethiopian economy and the most vulnerable population on a chokehold, on an economic chokehold for the next 10 years. But I think we've said a lot about the economic impact. So I think we must look at some of the other unintended consequences of such a sanctioned bill. And I think one of the unintended consequences of this bill is the dispute over the Welkite-Humara corridor, or what the TPLF and their Western allies refer to as Western Tigray. You know, now for over a year, officials from the State Department, Congress, the EU, the UK, Australia have all backed this, and medias like CNN, New York Times, BBC have all spoken with a consistent and unified voice, and they've all made it crystal clear where they stand on this issue. They all officially recognize this corridor as Western Tigray, a sovereign territory of the TPLF. Starting from the March 2021 congressional hearing, where Secretary Blinken testified, declaring that an ethnic cleansing is happening in Western Tigray, to the most recent call by members like Ilhan Omar from Minnesota, Brad Sherman from California, and the likes, to this week's press release from the Amnesty International, they're all consistent in calling for the removal of Amhara and Eritrean forces from Welkite. And consistently, they're all using humanitarian cause as a reason with alleged atrocities being committed against Tigrayans who live in the area. And all these global bodies are united in their position, and they're all saying for peace and stability to be possible, the removal of Amhara and Eritrean forces required from Western Tigray. And backed by the media propaganda campaign to demonize Amhara forces, to demonize Eritrea, and to shamelessly downplay atrocities committed by the TPLF against the people of Amhara, against the people of Afar, and against the people of Tigray. And once again, this is a classic example of using selective outrage and propagandized humanitarian allegations as a pretext for a political goal. And the political goal here is clear, and it is to give the TPLF access to an international border through the Welkite-Humara corridor. And they've all shown that they're willing to do anything to make this happen, including, let me remind you, a sensationalized CNN report by NEMA of bodies floating on the Takaze River, using this media reports to push legislation for the declaration of genocide in Western Tigray. The declaration of genocide, which is now the centerpiece of HR 6600. It is mentioned in this bill 12 times. And if you look at Section 10 of HR 6600, Section 10, it specifically calls on the State Department to make a determination of genocide within 90 days after the enactment of this act. Yes, 90 days. Never mind that the United Nations and the Ethiopian Human Rights Commissions have all already completed an exhaustive independent investigation and have determined that while atrocities were committed on both sides, there was no evidence of genocide in Tigray. or in Welkite. They have now gone back to the United Nations Security Council. They're arm-twisted several nations to sign off on yet another UN investigation. And just 2 days ago, they've managed to get the approved for this investigation. They're doing whatever it takes to continue to push this narrative until they meet this political goal. HR 6600, I argue, is yet another wing of this effort. If passed, it will require for the determination of genocide and the enforcement of demands to remove Amhara and Eritrea forces from northern Gondar. This will be one of the most significant unintended consequences because the sanction will put the Ethiopian government, the Eritrean government, and the Amhara forces an economic chokehold, progressively increasing punitive measures, potentially forcing them to concede, to withdraw, increasing the likelihood of TPLF regaining sovereignty over the land and potentially having an international border to have the option to secede Tigray. This is not a risk that Ethiopia can take. This is not a risk that the Ethiopian people can afford to take. The issue of Welkite is the issue of peace for Ethiopia and peace for Eritrea and peace for the greater Horn of Africa. I will end with a reminder from history. When the TPLF was fighting the Derg in the 1980s, arguably, the Welkite-Humera corridor was the single most important strategic place the TPLF fought for and gained first because they needed that access to Sudan. So having access to Sudan was a critical logistical requirement, whether it was to bring in weapons, supplies, or train their fighters, which were trained in Sudan. Even the late Meles Zenawi was for many years based in Sudan, operating in and out of Ethiopia through this corridor. That is why I think the TPLF annexed this area when they finally took over, and that's why they're now fighting so hard to get it back. But this time, they're not fighting alone. They have the entire international organization behind them to force this into happening. So I ask everyone that cares for peace, for Ethiopia, Eritrea, and the Horn of Africa. I ask for anyone that cares for the sovereignty of Ethiopia, and anyone that cares for the Welkite and Tagade people that have suffered under the TPLF, not just for 27 years, mind you, for 40 years, for 4 decades. The price they've paid, the pain and suffering is too much, unimaginable. So I call on everyone, and this is the time to unite under this and say no on HR 66, S3199, and any economic sanction bill that comes against Ethiopia, Eritrea, Somalia, the entire Africa. Enough is enough, and we say no more to economic sanctions. Thank you, Wasi.
Thank you. Excuse me, if you have any questions, put them in writing, and also please mute yourself. I'm seeing some people are unmuted, but please mute yourself. We're going to have the discussion after all the speakers have spoken, all the presenters have spoken. There'll be plenty of time. Okay, so our next speaker is going to be, I'm sorry, Navi, thank you so much, because I did not want to forget that, you know, to tell people to put their questions in there. But thank you, this was also very, very, as usual, very enlightening and very powerful. Our next speaker is Binyam Awash, who is a professor of sociology and human rights at the State University of New York and in Binghamton. And he's going to be talking about sanctions. He's going to be presenting on sanctions today. So Binyam, go ahead.
Thank you, Wasi. ሰላም ለሁላችሁም እኔም በአጭሩ 8 ደቂቃ አለኝ እስቲ በእንግሊዝኛ ልናገር እንደ ነብዩ So I'll continue on in English. Thank you for the opportunity. I look at this more as a conversation about sanctions and the significance of sanctions as it's approaching to targeting Ethiopia. So I wanted to raise in the 8 minutes that I have, basically 4 short points. The first is, what are sanctions? Meaning, how do we think about sanctions? What are the origins of sanctions? What are they meant to do? As the lawyer Derajeh was asking, does the particular bill that is going to target Ethiopia ይጠቅማል አይጠቅምም? So that way of thinking implies sanctions, some of them must be useful. And let's see if that's the case. That's the first point. The second point, are sanctions legal, by the way, or are sanctions illegal? What kinds of sanctions are legal or illegal? The third point, what are the effects on sanctions? And to a certain extent, several of our guests, fellow panelists have actually addressed some of these things, and I'll just give some illustrations of the effects of sanctions. And lastly, point number 4, assuming these sanctions are successfully passed, how do we get off the list? When does the sanctions end? And so let's look at some cases that gives us some insight into this. So first point regarding what sanctions are. A really interesting set of scholarship has been developed around really conceptualizing and understanding sanctions. በአማርኛ ማዕቀብ ስንል, when we say ማዕቀብ, that implies pretty much nothing. ጦርነት, that implies something negative. So the term sanctions itself, this is my point. Sanctions are a form of siege, warfare, and terror. That's what sanctions are. So in fact, we can simply call it siege, warfare, and terror. Now, as it developed, sanctions for the first time was during the League of Nations. And it's very interesting because in the demise of the League of Nations, which is, let's say, the sister institution to the United Nations, the League of Nations partly was dissolved as a result of the invasion of Ethiopia and the issue around Italy and Ethiopia. If you recall, without getting into details, there were sanctions that were put on Italy and Ethiopia, but the sanctions meaningfully were targeting Ethiopia's ability to defend itself. So when it was developed, and here I just made a claim that it is siege, warfare, and terror. So let's see what the people that were developing this instrument said. So I'm quoting here from a wonderful book by Nicholas Mulder, who's here in upstate in Cornell. And his book is called The Economic Weapon, The Rise of Sanctions as a Tool of Modern War. And in that, he quotes President Woodrow Wilson, US President Woodrow Wilson in 1919, who says, we have a wonderful tool in the League of Nations to keep peace, stability. They didn't use the words of human rights then, but this tool was sanctions. And he describes it as such, something more tremendous than war, an absolute isolation that brings a nation to its senses, just as suffocation removes from the individual all inclinations to fight. It is a terrible remedy, but it brings pressure upon that nation, which no modern nation could resist. So today, sanctions are generally regarded as an alternative to war, right? How it's presented, not during its beginnings and how people thought of it. So remember World War I and later on World War II, 1919s. So majority of people during that time thought of sanctions and understood sanctions as a form of total warfare against the society, right? So let me quote another example from Woodrow Wilson. He said, if thoughtful men have thought and truly thought that war is barbarous, sanction is an infinitely more terrible instrument of war. Another individual who is an administrator for a British blockade, William Arnold Foster, during the Great War, states, we tried, just as the Germans tried, to make our enemies unwilling that the children should be born. We tried to bring enemies unwilling that their children should be born. We tried to bring about such a state of destitution that those children, if born at all, should be born dead. That is the objective of sanctions. And this is really remarkable because they're honest. And one of the most important aspects of actually being honest and spelling out what sanctions are about and intending to do is to create fear and terror in states so they change their behavior. That was the aim, and to this very day as well. So moving on to point number 2, are sanctions legal? We're having a discussion here about bills that are going to be passed or debated. Hopefully they're not going to be passed and made into law, but are these legal? There's only one way in which sanctions can be legal, and that is if they are through the United Nations system. They have to be voted upon and have the support of the international community in order for them to be legal. What the US is engaging in is an act that is against international law. It is illegal. And this is again from the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, which I'm going to quote. He says, US sanctions are illegal under international law because they were not endorsed by the UN Security Council. Simple. So the activity of sanctioning that the US has used as a tool of foreign policy is an act that is illegal in international law. If Ethiopia was to engage in a similar act, India was to engage in a similar act, it would be reprimanded as a criminal would be in breaking the law. So that's a very important aspect. So in this context about the importance of law, in order to have actually rule of the law on this planet at an international community, following rule of law is very important. So there's a group of countries that have come together by the name of Friends of the UN Charter. And the Friends of the UN Charter are specifically organized in order that international law follow the UN Charter, the sanctity of sovereignty, and not using illegal sanctions, which are called coercive actions that are illegal, so unilateral, meaning the US, for instance, can decide to put sanctions on Nicaragua, on Ethiopia, on Sudan. These are acts that are illegal. So when we look at the acts that are illegal, that are used by the US, it is part of US foreign policy in order to achieve political objectives. So since about 1990s, US and to a certain extent Europe have put over 500 times. They've employed sanctions on other nations at least 500 times. When we look at the African continent since about 2020, we have countries like Eritrea, Somalia, Zimbabwe, Congo DRC, Sudan, South Sudan, Libya under Muammar Gaddafi, the Central African Republic, all these countries under US unilateral sanctions, which are again illegal, with the exception of, let's say, South Sudan and Eritrea, which of course we disagree with vehemently, but the process, legally speaking, any sanction that is voted on by the UN Security Council is technically legal, right? So that's just to keep in mind the distinction between legal and illegal. So what we're talking about in the context of Ethiopia is an attempt to engage an act of criminality at an international level. That's the first and foremost. The third point that I want to raise are the effects of sanctions. What are the effects of sanctions? There's one word that we can use: kill. Sanctions kill. Sanctions destroy. The UN Human Rights Council presentation, this is very dear to me because I have many friends from Venezuela. And this is from a report in September 2019. The report on sanctions on Venezuela states, sanctions kill. They fall most heavily on the poorest people in society, demonstratively cause death through food and medicine shortages. They lead to violations of human rights and are aimed at coercing change. Particularly in the case of Venezuela, it's described as a sister democracy. There's a fact-finding mission in 2017 by the same UN Human Rights Council representative. This is Dizias, former chair. And in the 2017 fact-finding mission to the country, he finds that economic warfare practiced by the US, EU, and Canada are significant factors in the economic crisis in Venezuela. A report by Jeffrey Sachs and Mark Wisbord in August 2017, looking at the effects of sanctions on civilian population of Venezuela. This is what they find. Sanctions reduce the public's caloric intake. That's called forced dieting. Increased disease and mortality, displacing millions of Venezuelans who are going to flee their country for survival. It made it impossible to stabilize Venezuela's economic crisis. And sanctions disproportionately harmed the poorest and most vulnerable of those Venezuelans. Just a few things regarding the effects of sanctions, and I'll move to my last point. A most frequently cited example of sanctions is that of Iraq, even in the literature itself. Iraq was put under sanctions from 1990 to 2003. And the effects, even though this is a legal sanction that was voted on by the UN Security Council, the effects studied, not debated, was that it had a devastating effect on Iraq's children. Over 500,000 children died because of these sanctions. So this issue, by the way, technicality of dual use is remarkably cynical. Toothpaste would be stopped from entering Iraq because it could be construed as dual use. It shows you the degree to which these sanction policies are a form, again, of warfare and terror. Sanctions also of oil and gas. The price of food, Ethiopia is essentially a food importer, not just through the mechanisms of aid, but also about $2 billion worth every year that the government spends to import wheat in order to outlay the shortfall of domestic production. So the price of wheat in the international market is going to increase. Fertilizers is going to increase. So sanctions lead to higher prices. Talk to your relatives and friends, Addis Ababa, Yalut, or anywhere in Ethiopia, and you will see the degree to which people are really suffering due to the extremely expensive nature of living. There's another element that's very interesting about sanctions. Uniformly, case after case after case, we see that it destroys the middle class of a society and it targets the poor. So in summary, sanctions are meant and they're designed. And this is very important to understand. This is not, we don't have bureaucrats, both in the United States Department of Treasury and elsewhere, that are designing sanctions with somehow unintended consequences of 500,000 children dying. We have sanctions that are designed specifically to destroy countries, not to achieve human rights, nor democracy. In some cases, even I would say not even to achieve regime change, right? Lastly, a last point. Heaven forbid, God forbid, we're on a sanctions list. Ethiopia is on a sanctions list. And this sanctions list, being on it, implies at least 10 years of probation, so to speak, where you have monitoring and control to see whether the behavior of the Ethiopian government accords with the desires of those that are designing the sanctions. So how do we get off? We have to comply. So let's see an example of a sister country, the Sudan. October 1997, the US imposes a total sanctions. There's different degrees of sanctions. AGOA is a smaller element, having sanctions on leaders, political leaders, business leaders. But the type of sanctions that is represented, that is targeting Ethiopia, is one that is total in nature: financial, economic, security, etc. So Sudan experienced something like that in 1997. In order to remove itself and to have sanctions removed and to get off the blacklist, there was certain conditions that it had to meet. The first, and the reason why sanctions were put, was because of terror violence. If you remember the bombing of the embassies in, I believe, Tanzania and Kenya by Al-Qaeda groups during that time, it was blamed on Sudan because Sudan was harboring some members of that group. So the original charge was for engaging or supporting acts of state terrorism. It was put on the list. So one of the first things that it required was to recognize that, and then to pay the victims of those families, American victims of the terrorism, not Kenyan and not Tanzanian victims, only American citizen victims of those acts, by the way, were paid indemnity, about $350-something million by the Sudanese government. Then it was taken off the list, except there were additional demands. The Trump administration was trying to achieve a political objective of having Israel recognized. So Sudan was forced to recognize Israel, normalize relations with Israel, a political demand that came completely out of thin air, that had nothing to do with the original reason why even this sanction was placed on Sudan, right? So this tells you the arbitrary nature of what does it take to get off this list. Very arbitrary and political nature that depends again on American bureaucrats and officials. So for Ethiopia, lastly, about 1 minute and I'm finished. This is my last point. What are the US demands? So the way that it's been framed, it's very interesting, is that the US perhaps doesn't have any goals. It is being perhaps misinformed. The TPLF, yes, it's very well funded. Yes, it has its own objectives that it's trying to achieve. And so this is kind of an attempt to bring the US to the position of the Ethiopian people primarily. And that represented by the government. I would suggest this. The US demands so far the withdrawal of Eritrean forces, Amara militia forces, which Nabi just mentioned. Second, the launch of international human rights investigation in order to investigate crimes against humanity. The third.
ባካችሁን ሚውት አርጓቸው ሰዎቹን I thought we were controlling that.
Biniam, you're unmute yourself.
Yeah.
Okay, so I was just going to read out very quickly. The US has set demands that have been relatively consistent. And these demands, to a certain extent, have also increased. So let's just say there's visible demands and there's demands that are unstated in public. So if in my discussion so far, I'm trying to convince you perhaps to look at the track record and the understanding of sanctions as political tools that do not have anything to do with democracy promotion, with stabilization of a country, or with the promotion of human rights and dialogue, right? But rather political objectives. In this context, the US has come out with a laundry list of demands: withdrawal of Eritrean forces, Amara militia forces. Think of it as National Guards. So that goes inside the sovereign decision of the Ethiopian government of how it uses its National Guards. Nebiyu has mentioned to a certain extent what this is really attached to, right? With the Welkite issue in Western areas. Second is launch of international human rights investigations. A third demand, unhindered humanitarian access. Lastly, a dialogue, national dialogue, and specifically actually a unity government, right? If you remember. So these are the four demands that have been consistent. And I want you to think about this. The Ethiopian government has, and we should be very clear, made some concessions to the incredible pressure that the US has put on the government. And you can see it point by point what these concessions are. But there's an interesting, I think, dilemma for us to ask. So what exactly is the goal of the US? Is it really these 4 points? So what are the unstated demands that are being asked of Ethiopia, which could be very devastating to the sovereignty and the well-being of the general population? So with that last point, I thank you for the opportunity and I look forward to our question and answer.
Thank you, Professor Biniam. It's very, very enlightening. And of course, we just wanted to hear more of what you had to say. And I hope in the discussion we'll get more. But at this time, I do want to say we do have some action items because we just did not talk about them. And I'd ask the co-hosts to put them in our chat room. What are some of the solutions people are asking us that, we have to approach Congress and we have to approach the Senate. And at this time, the two most important people in Congress and in the Senate are Schumer and in the Senate and Pelosi in the Congress, because if they don't take the bill to the floor, there will be no vote on it. So what we say is we have the numbers for you. Please call. I know this is very lightweight when we say call after listening to all this, but it's very important that you call. And it's and also Senator Inhofe, because he can play a very critical role if this bill, the Senate bill, goes to Congress, because he can filibuster it and then it won't go anywhere. Just one senator is needed to do that. And whereas in the Congress, it's a simple majority that there we could be lost. So the only way not to do it is for Pelosi not to put it on the floor. So we'll come back, again and again, and we'll talk about that, and we'll talk about it in the discussions, and just go to the chat and copy the numbers off of there. Okay, thank you. So at this time, Hermela is going to discuss with us some examples. I think she's going to just by showing us what some of these things are in the bill. So she's going to unpack that for us. Hermela, you have 8 minutes.
I might not need all that. A lot of people covered a lot of what I was going to say, which is good. So can I share my screen, Asia?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's either Ayu or what's his name? Kalalai, who can give.
Let me. Yeah, actually, it will.
Should be able to, yeah,
cool. Thanks. Just checking. All right. Let me move some of this out of the way so we could see. Okay, so I know we've kind of focused so much on, let me make this bigger so you guys can see. I know we focused so much on HR 6600 because it seems to have a little more support from just outside of the pro-TPLF activists or TPLF. But I do think S3199 is just as dangerous just because it's more savvy. And Dereja actually hit on a lot of these, which is good because it makes me feel like I'm in the right direction. So I'll just go through a few things. I think the general approach is like the good old classic. We need to get unfettered aid in, humanitarian access to Tigray. It's a lot more, I don't know if they updated it recently, but it definitely mixes some truth with the lies, which is, I think, more dangerous when it comes to it potentially passing through the full Senate. So a couple of things. So to the point that I just made, it really just only talks about unfettered access, humanitarian access to Tigray. And we know there's the people that are blocking the aid or making it difficult for the aid to get in is TPLF itself. Right now, there's lots of signs that some aid is getting in, but it looks, it just seems like they want to get all in there so that they're able to pass through whatever it is they are able to. And then if TPLF were to come back into power, they would just be like, well, it just happened. And there's indications that they don't recognize TPLF as an armed group or a rebel group. So they actually see them as a legitimate actor that should come to the negotiating table. And then Dereja touched on this, so I won't get too much into it, but the fact that they put this in this report just really shows what they're most worried about, which is being able to have access. This is the comment the Prime Minister made about the food aid. If it doesn't enter Ethiopia, 70% of Ethiopia's problems will be solved. The fact that they're so offended by that, I think, says a lot. And it speaks to that whole humanitarian access thing. And then there's a very clear trying to delegitimize the government by casting doubt on the elections. You see at the bottom here, sorry, there's too much text. They talked about the elections being highly contentious, which is fine, but did not meet internationally accepted standards. And the report that Professor Ann Fitzgerald did months back now went into the fact that it did meet the standards. It had 100 international observers. It had 100,000 local observers. So this is sort of trying to set the stage, I think, to do what they were trying to do all this time, which is to overthrow the government through TPLF and their allied forces. And one more thing, so okay, we'll move on because there's a couple other points to this. And then there's a few things. I'm not going to talk much about sanctions because there are experts on here that have already talked about it and everybody's touched on it. But it tells us a lot when you look at S3199. It really reveals what the tactic was. I don't think that's what their intention was. But for example, okay, again, officials from the TPLF and Oromo Liberation Army, OLA, a rebel group engaged in armed struggle primarily in the Oromia region. So at TPLF, they're officials, OLA, they're a rebel group. That kind of thing just really opens the door for them to be able to get the seat at the table, not more than just a seat at the table. I mean, I personally think they have to be a part of the negotiations somehow. I don't know how else you're going to do it, but this really opens the door for them to actually get back into power, which obviously is if we lived in a normal world, that wouldn't even be a conversation. And so this is talking about in August when TPLF and OLA announced that they had entered an official alliance, and it said it was happening during the time, let me just read it. Officials from the TPLF and Oromo Liberation Front, a rebel group, publicly confirmed that they had entered an alliance designed to coordinate the military operations against the federal government Ethiopia. Developments which occurred against the backdrop of TPLF advances in Amhara region and increased OLA activity in Oromia. That confirms to me the tactic was to cause issues with TPLF and OLA in the south, in the Oromia region, and then as they're coming from the north, and then there would be a mysterious coup and they would be in power, so they'd be able to write the story of exactly how that happened. So I think a lot of this opens the door for TPLF just to come back into power. I mean, the fact that they may use OLA, they may use OLA to get there, but it seems like it's clear that it's all about legitimizing TPLF and the language that it uses. Yeah, so this is what they're talking about. So this also speaks to what some people's concerns that do support HR 6600. It's about the security issues largely in the South. Well, the Senate knew that was happening. They, it's so interesting that they can talk about, elections that are not up to international standards and then just gloss over the fact that two armed groups officially announced that they are in allyship to overthrow the government. I mean, it's like, again, in a different world, this would all be backwards. A little bit on the sanctions that talks about to use the voice and vote of the U.S. and those institutions to oppose, and is talking about the international financial institutions, to oppose any loan or extension of financial or technical assistance to the governments of Ethiopia and Eritrea. So again, it's really focused on Ethiopia and Eritrea, or punishing them. And it doesn't say, if you were really worried about everybody in this fight, you would also levy sanctions towards TPLF and OLA and other LF armed actors. So that's important to know. And we've all already hit on this. Inflation is super high in Ethiopia. Even when I was there, it's ridiculous how much birr you have to use to just pay for everyday things. And that's for those of us coming from the outside with dollars. For local people, things are getting really difficult. And when things are difficult, security doesn't get better. I do believe that at least some of the issues with security is a matter of resources. I mean, we saw what happened when the prime minister went to the forefront. Whatever sabotage there was that allowed the TPLF to get all the way to where they got to went away. And so there's a lot of internal treason. There's just a lot of internal treason, I think. And I think having less birr to work, less dollars actually to work with, and having a weaker economy is not going to make it invest more in security. That's just my take. All right, let's move on to HR 6600. Again, this is going to impact security because it says that prohibits assistance with certain exceptions to Ethiopia's security forces. That's everybody. That's police, any local security forces. It doesn't make sense if you're trying to bring peace or stability to then limit the financial assistance that security forces could have. It makes more sense to try to help them figure out who is doing their job and who's actually using their positions to cause chaos, probably with the approval or the sort of tacit approval from the U.S. as Getachew Reda was just really revealed to us. That was a golden moment when he talked about the U.S. wanting them to go all the way to Addis. So it's really interesting to me that people have forgotten. It hasn't been that long that we were seeing, pro-TPLF activists and TPLF basically bragging about going to Addis. The Senate bill confirms that there was kind of a two-way strategy from the north, from the south. It just didn't work. So I think they're trying to formalize that tactic through both of these bills. Genocide designation is a part of 6600 within 90 days of this bill. State Department must report to Congress a determination of whether actions in Ethiopia by the armed forces of Ethiopia and Eritrea, the Tigray People's Liberation Front. I think they and I'm sure Daraja knows this better than me, they're intentionally never saying TPLF is an armed group, a rebel group. I mean, if it's Armed Forces of Ethiopia and Eritrea, then it should just be Armed Forces of the Tigray People's Liberation Front at the very least. But as you see again here, TPLF and other armed actors, it really separates them from being a rebel group, which opens the door for a lot of things. This is a other thing which we've talked about. There needs to be, or Congress expects a report from their own, but about the Ethiopian government every 6 months about efforts to bring this war to an end, humanitarian access, all of that. But again, since they have decided exactly what story that they want to believe about what's going on there, they're only going to write one story in those reports and nothing different. Again, opening signs that they're opening the door for negotiations with TPLF. The president shall impose the sanctions that it proposed with respect to any foreign person that the president determines seeks to undermine efforts with respect to a ceasefire and negotiated settlement to end the civil war or other conflicts. There's one more point to that: actions and involvement of senior officials of the government of Ethiopia, the government of Eritrea, the TPLF, and armed opposition groups. Again, it sees it as legitimate and wants to bring it back to the table. Genocide designation names other groups. It doesn't even name OLA, which is so interesting. I don't know if that was just, they didn't even think about it, but for those who are worried about some of the security issues in the South, I think it would have been worth at least mentioning it instead of allowing it to just stay under armed actors. So they can do whatever they want with that. And a determination, we know the reason that they want the determination of genocide so badly, and they're unlikely to pin it on TPLF because they never have. They've never even recognized, their issues with other ethnicities being attacked. So the issue with a genocide determination is it allows them to go in. Like, they don't have to beat around the bush or go through aid. It could, technically speaking, open the door for them to get involved militarily, although maybe Daraja knows more about this. I don't know if it has to be an international designation, but it seems to me a State Department designation would also open the door for something like that. All right. Every time you read this, you find something new, and then I'm gonna wrap it up. You find something new. So there's a point about, this report that they're collecting in the State Department. And I'm sorry I didn't have as much time to prepare. There's so much text, but I'll try to just point it out. It talks about, the determination required under subsection shall be submitted in unclassified form and published on a publicly available website of the Department of State. Okay, but may include a classified annex if such annex is provided separately from the unclassified determination. So they can decide what to make public in terms of information and what they're going to hold on to from this unclassified entity. So I think they're just trying to do what TPLF did, which is repeat the story, except this time they're trying to be a little bit savvier about it. And with that, I'm going to wrap. Thank you.
Thank you, Amela. This was really very, very powerful. And, you asked a question. People have forgotten TPLF. And then, people have forgotten the TPLF right now because we're fighting amongst each other. I mean, the TPLF does not need to do anything right now. And that just really breaks my heart that we've reached this far, because one of the things they were saying was breaking the opposition, splitting the opposition. And it looks like they've almost done it. The other thing is, when all of you went through this, and showed us the bills and the sanctions, and when you started unpacking it piece by piece, I just wonder, have people read this? Have they read it even once? And sadly, the conclusion I come to is most people, even those that are supporting or against it, have not read it. That's why people do not understand how detrimental these two bills are. And that's why events like what we have right now is so important, so that people can come and really listen to this. I mean, I learn more every time we do this, and that's very, very important. So I just jumped in. I'm sorry. I got all,
No, it was a good addendum. Yeah, I really, this time I learned more stuff I didn't see before. I didn't make these connections. So really, if people at least haven't read it once, it's okay. I get it. Everyone's busy, but this is a good moment to just kind of read a few things together. So
yes, and let our friends know. I mean, people that are thinking this is good, they need to understand what it means. So now we would, I know we were all wanting to go into the discussion, but before we go to the discussion, we have our Afar brother and sister from the Afar diaspora who are going to do a short presentation, because we did say this is going to be a fundraiser for them, and it's absolutely important. And please put the Zelle number in there. And so with this, I invite first Abu Bakr and then Hanawi. Go ahead.
الرحمن الرحيم الصلاة والسلام على رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم مجمريا የኢትዮጵያ ሙስሊም አማኞች ለዚህ ለጾም ለረመዳን እንኳን አደረሳችሁ እላለሁ በመቀጠልም እናንተ የምታደርጉት ትግል በጣም ጠቃሚ ነው HR 6600 ለኢትዮጵያ ህዝብና መንግስትም ኢኮኖሚ እንደሚጎዳ በጣም አደገኛ መሆኑን ለመግለጽ እወዳለሁ እኛም ተቃውመናል ኒውጀርሲም በተደረገው ሰልፍ ተሳትፈናል ነገር ግን ኢትዮጵያ መንግስት ላይ ቅሬታ አለን እንደገናም ደግሞ የአሜሪካ መንግስትም ይሁን እንደገናም ደግሞ የወርልድ ፉድ ፕሮግራም የአፋር ህዝብ እየተራበ ምግቡ ወደ ትብልፍ ወይ እንዲያልፍ ጫና እየተደረገባቸው ህዝቡም እየተቃወመ ነው ድምጻቸው የሚሰማ የለም መጀመሪያ የአፋር ህዝብ በጣም ነው የተጎዳው በዚህ በጦርነት የተፈናቀሉት አሉ የሞቱት አሉ ጉዳቱም በጣም በክልላችን ውስጥ ስለሆነ መሳሪያም ትልቁም መሳሪያም የሚያርፈው እንደገና ደግሞ TPLF በዚህም እርዳታም ይፈልጋል እንደገና ወረራውን አላቆመም አሁን የአፋር ህዝብ ጥያቄ TPLF ከአፋር ክልል ሁሉ መውጣት አለበት እርዳታ እንዲሄድ ከፈለገ ከአፋር ክልል ወጥቶ ወደ ነበረበት ቦታ መመለስ አለበት እና እኛ አሁን የኢትዮጵያ መንግስትም ደግሞ ቅሬታ አለብን እኛ በችግር ጊዜ ደራሽ አፋር ህዝብ ነው ግንባሩን የሰጠው አፋር ህዝብ ነው በጦርነቱ የተጎዳ አፋር ህዝብ ነው ግን መንግስትም ይረሳናል የኢትዮጵያ መንግስት እንደገና ደግሞ ስልጣን ላይ የሚያመጣው አደም ፈራህ በአፋርና በኢሳ ግጭት እጁ ያለበት ተብሎ ሆን ብሎ ስልጣኑን የሚሰጠው ለአደም ፈራህ እንዴት ይሆናል ብሎ የአፋር ተወካይ በፓርላማ ስጠይቅ ምንም መልስ አልተሰጠለትም ያንን ቅሬታ አለን መንግስትም ደግሞ የኛም ድምጽ መስማት አለበት የአፋር ድምጽ መስማት አለበት እንደገና በጦርነት ጊዜ ኢትዮጵያን ያዳነው አፋር ህዝብ ነው የአፋር ወጣቶች ናቸው ግን አንድ በመከላከያ ውስጥ አንድ የአፋር ተወላጅ ስልጣን የተሰጠው የለም እና ብዙ ቅሬታ አለ መንግስቱም ደግሞ በሚያደርገው እንትን አፋርን ማሳተፍ አለበት በሰላም ደግሞ ኢትዮጵያ ሰላም እንደሚመጣኛ ዱዓ ያረግን ነው ግን ሰላም አፋርን ህዝብ ያሳተፈ ውይይት መሆን አለበት በችግር ጊዜ እኛ ነው ቅድሚያ ግን በውይይት ጊዜ ይረሱናል ስለዚህ የኢትዮጵያ ህዝብ አፋር ህዝብን እንዲረዳ ደግሞ አሁን የተፈናቀሉት ወገኖች አሉ የወገን ደራሽ ነው የቻሉትን ያደርጋሉ ግን አሁን በጦርነት የተደረገው በግጭቱ በጣም በአገር ውስጥ በውጭም እርዳታም ያስፈልጋል እኔ መልክተን በዚህም ነው የሚጨርሰው እንደሞ የላኩት እንትን አለ እንትን ያንን ፎቶ ብታሳይ በጣም ደስ ይለናል በጣም የተጎዱት አሉ በጦርነቱም ውስጥ አማራም ተጎድቷል አፋርም ተጎድቷል ትግራይም ተጎድቷል ይሄ የውስጡ እንትን ጦርነት እንዲቆም እኛ በዚህ በጾም ወር ጦሎች እናደርጋለን ኢትዮጵያ ሰላም እንዲሆን ሰላም እንዲሰፍን የእርስ በርስ ግጭት አላህ እንዲያነሳ በጦርነቱ እንዲቆምብን ለሰላም ጸሎት እናደርጋለን በዚህ ጨርሳለን
በጣም እናመሰግናለን አቶ አቡበከር አሁን ሀናዊን ብታቀርቡልን ደስ ይለናል እና I'm going to share her PowerPoint Hanawi unmute yourself and wait oh, that's not what I wanted to share 1 second okay
በጣም አመሰግናለሁ ይሄን እድል ሰጣችሁኝ እዚህ ጋር ችግራችንን ለመስማት ስላቀረባችሁ እነዚህ እዚህ ጋር የምታያቸው እነዚህ ውጭ ላይ ነው ተጠልለው ነው ያሉት በጎዳና ላይ ነው የሚገኙት አፋሮች ናቸው ኢትዮጵያዊ ናቸው የሳርዶን መንገድ ወይም የሚሌ መንገድ ያዝ እነዚህ ለዚህ አይበቁም ነበር እና ለኢትዮጵያ ብሎ ነው ይሄን ሁሉ መስዋዕት እየከፈሉ ያሉት ባሎቻቸው ደግሞ ህይወታቸውን እየገበሩ ነው ያሉት እና ይሄ የሁሉም የዜጋ ጉዳይ ሊሆን ይገባል ይሄ ደግሞ እንደምታያት ልጅ ጋር ነው ያለችውና እናት ናት ምንም ላይክ የምታደርግለት የምታበላው ነገር እንደሌላት ነው ኢቭን ፒክቸሩ ለራሱ ያሳያል እና ቀጣይ ላይ ደግሞ ያለው ህፃን ልጅ ወንድሙን ታቅፎ ነው ያለው እና እዚህ ጋር የሚታያቸው ምስሎች እንዳለ በጣም የማሳዘን ሳይሆን በጣም ሰዎች የሚያሳስብ ሁኔታ ላይ እንዳሉ ነው የሚያስረዳው እና ህፃኑ ልጅ ወንድሙን ታቅፎ ነው ያለው በጣም መሄድ አቅቶት ነው ኢቭን እንዴት ላይክ መሄድ ሁላ አቅቶታል አይ ሚን መግለጽ እየከበደኝ ነው እንደዚህ አይነት ነገር በህይወታችን አይተነው ሰምተነው ማናቅ ነው ለኛ አዲሳችን እንደዚህ አይነት ሁኔታ ላይ ዘመዶቻችን እዚህ ጋር ደግሞ ህፃናቶች ናቸው የተወለዱ ህፃናቶች ናቸው ያሉት እነዚህ ደግሞ ወደ 27 ሴቶች ትላይ ነው ጫካ ውስጥ ነው በመሃል ላይ መንገድ ጉዞ ላይ ሆኖ ነው የተወለዱት እና ወደ 27 ሴት ነው ከአንድ ወረዳ ብቻ እና በጣም የሚያሳዝን እና የሚያሳስብ ሁኔታ ላይ ነው ያለው አፋር ታዲያ ለምንድነው እኛ ሌላ ጊዜ ድሮን ምናምን ነገር ይባላል ነገኛ ከኢትዮጵያ ጋር ምን አይነት ነገር ነው የሚኖረን በእንደዚህ በዛሬ በችግራችን ዝም ካለ ይሄ ደግሞ ህፃን ልጅ እናትየዋ ሁለት መንታ ወልዳ ህፃኑ ልጅ ሲበታተኑ ላይክ እሷ ከአንደኛው ልጅ ጋር ብቻ ነው የቀረችው አንደኛውን ደግሞ አብሯት የነበሩ ሰዎች ይዘውት ሄደው እስከ 3 ቀን በኋላ ነው ልጇን ሁላ ያገኘችው because አብሮ በመንገድ ላይ እሷ ወደ ኋላ ቀረች ሌሎች ደግሞ ሄዱ ከሷ ቀድሞ የነበሩት እና በጣም ይቅርታ በጣም ውስጤ በጣም ስለተሰማው ነው anyway ይሄ ሁላ ነገር የሚገጥመን እኛ ይሄ ጦርነት እኮ አይመለከተንም ቢሄዱ ቢባሉ ይሄ ሁላ አይፈጠርም እናቶችም አይወልዱም እንደዚህ አይነት ችግር ውስጥ አይገቡም ነበር አፋሮች to be honest እና ያ ደግሞ እንዳለ ሆኖ ይሄን ሁላ ያደረጉ እንዳልሰማ በችግር ታሪያ ካልተረዳዳን ለመቼ ነው የምንሆነው ለመቼ ነው ኢትዮጵያዊነታችን ያልፋል ይሄ ቀን ያልፋል እንደ ታሪክ የሚወራበት ጊዜ ይኖራል ግን በዚህ ሰዓት ከጎናችን የሚሆነው ነው ወንድማችን ያንን ነው ማለት የምፈልገው እኔ በጣም ግዴታም ስለሆነብኝ ነው እዚህ ጋር እንትን ያልኩ ያለሁት እንጂ አልለመድኩም ሁላ ላይ እንደዚህ ቪዲዮ ላይ ወጥቶ በጣም ፈሪ ነኝ በተፈጥሮዬ anyway አመሰግናለሁ
በጣም እናመሰግናለን ሀናዊ በጣም ልብ የሚነካ እንትን ነው ፕሬዘንቴሽን ያደረግሽው አውቃለሁ ምን ያህል ፈሪ ነኝ 10 ጊዜ ብለሽኝ ነበር እና በኃይል ነው ደስ ያለኝ እንደዚህ ወጥተሽ ማቅረብ መቻልሽ እና በእውነቱ በጣም ከባድ ነው
ድምጼ ግን እየተሰማሽ ነበረ
በደንብ እየተሰማኝ ነበር ሁላችንም አይደለ እየተሰማን አልነበረም በጣም እና በሌላም ጊዜ የበለጠ ማድረግ ይገባናል አሁን ግን ባካችሁን ሰፖርት ትንሽም እርዳታ ቢሆን አሁን የሰፍቲ ፋንድሬዘር ለማድረግ አንችልም ግን አሁን ሁላችሁም ዜል ቁጥሩ ተሰጥቶናል እዛ ውስጥ እንትን ሰትና ማንት የምትችሉትን ያህል ብትጨምሩ በጣም ደስ ይለናል እንደው ትንሽ ሶሊዳሪቲ እና ኮላቦሬሽናችንን ለማሳየት ምክንያቱም የኛ ጉዳይ ነው የአፋር ህዝብ የኛ ህዝብ ነው እኛም አፋር ነን እነሱም አማራ ናቸው እነሱም ትግሬ ናቸው እነሱም ኦሮሞ ናቸው እኛ አንድ ህዝብ ነን እነሱ ቢከፋፍሉንም እና አንድ ህዝብ
ይሄ ደግሞ ለዛሬ አፋር ይሄ ነገር አይመለከተኝም ብሎ ቢያሳልፍ የኢትዮጵያ የሁሉም ችግር ይሆን ነበር ለዚህም የበቁት እኮ የዋህነታቸው ነው እንጂ ሞኝነት አይደለም ላይክ ሰው ይወዳሉ ከልብ የኢትዮጵያን ህዝብ ሁሉንም ይወዳሉ እና ከኛ አልፎ የሚመጣ ነገር የለም በማለት ነው እንጂ ለዚህ ሁሉ አይበቁም ነበር ይሄ አሁን የሞቱ አሉ ከገደል ላይ የወደቁ አሉ እንደገና መኖራቸውም መሞታቸውም የማይታወቁ ብዙ ሰዎች አሉ እና እንደዚህ አይነት ሁኔታ ውስጥ ያሉት እኮ ለኢትዮጵያ ብሎ ሌላ ምንም ነገር የላቸው ለኢትዮጵያ ብሎ
ልክ ነው
ያዝገን ሁሉም ነበር አንድ ላይ ይሄ ነው እና በጣም ዝም አትበሉ በእናታችሁ ይሄ አሁን እዚህ ጋር የምታያቸው በጣም የሚያሳዝን ነገር ነው ሁኔታው በጣም አስከፊ ነው
ልክ ነው እና ደግሞ እዚህ ላይ መርሳት የሌለብን አህያ ውሃ ስለሚያጓጉዝ እግሩን እየሰበሩ ግመል እየተገደለ እንስሳም አልቀረም ሰው ብቻ አይደለም እዛ የተሰቃየው እና ቤት እየተቃጠለ እዛ የሼልተር በረሃ ውስጥ ምንድነው ቤት ከተቃጠለ እና አደራ እንትን እንደገና ጨምሩ እንትኑን ምንድነው የዜል ነምበሩን እንደገና ብትለጥፉ እዚህ ላይ ደስ ይለናል እና ስንት ብር ተሰበሰበም እንነግራችኋለን እዛም ሲገባ እንነግራችኋለን እና ባካችሁን ተባበሩ እና አሁን ወደ በጣም አመሰግንሻለሁ ናዊ
እሺ ቴንኪው
በጣም አቡበከር በጣም እናመሰግናለን እና አሁን ወደ እዚህ ላይ ኮሜንት ከሌለ ወደ ዲስካሽናችን እንገባለን ጥያቄያችሁን በእንትን አቅርቡ ነው ያልናችሁ በጽሁፍ አቅርቡ ነው ያልናችሁ እዚህ መሃል ከሆስት አንዱ የውም አንድ ጥያቄ ነበረኝ ብለሃል እና አንተን ከፈቱለት እንትን መጠየቅ ትችላለህ ከሄድ
እሺ አመሰግናለሁ እና ዋሲ የኔ ጥያቄ በእውነት እኔ አንድ ለመናገር ፈልገው ተናጋሪዎቹ በጣም ጥሩ ነጥቦችን አዳዲስ ነጥቦችን ሁሉ ተናግረዋል ተበቃ ደረጃ ነው ጥያቄ ለሱ ነው እንግዲህ ዋናው ነገር የነኚህ ሁለት የህግ ረቂቆች ኤችአር 6600 እና ኤስ 3199 ኢትዮጵያን ህዝቡን እንደሚጎዱ በደንብ ቀርቧል እና ህዝቡን መጉዳት ብቻ ሳይሆን የሚጎዱት ደግሞ ሰርቶ አደሩን ገንዘብ የሌለውን ህፃናቶችን ሽማግሌዎችን እንደሚጎዳ አስቀድሞ ነው ብዙ ሰዎች ስራቸውን እንደሚያጡ ብዙ ሰዎች ኢኮኖሚው ኢንፍሌሽኑ በጣም ስለከፍ ስለሚል ኑሮ በጣም እንደሚወደድባቸው ፎሬን ከረንሲ እንደማይኖር ይሄ ሁሉ በደንብ ዛሬ ተገልጿል አንድ ነጥብ አለ ግን ይሄን ትንሽ እንድንነጋገርበት እና እኛም በደንብ እንዲገባን የዚህ የሬሚታንስ ጉዳይ ሬሚታንስ የኢትዮጵያ የምንልከውን ገንዘብ ያቋርጠዋል ይቀንሰዋል የሚል ነው የኛ አመለካከት እና ይሄውም ደግሞ ለፕሬዚደንቱ ገደብ የሌለው ስልጣን ስለሚሰጠው ኢትዮጵያ ላይ ሳንክሽን እንዲያነሳ ተጨማሪም ደግሞ ሳንክሽኖች ስለሚያደርግ በዛ መልክ ሌሎችም አገር የተደረጉትን በመመልከት ሬሚታንስን ይቀንሰዋል ይጎዳል የሚል ነው እና እንደምታውቁት ኢትዮጵያ ውስጥ የሚገባው ሬሚታንስ $5 billion a year ከውጭ ደግሞ ብድርና ከእርዳታ ከኢንተርናሽናል ድርጅቶች ከአሜሪካ ከአውሮፓ ከዩሮፕ እና ከዩናይትድ ኔሽን መጣው almost $4 billion ነው 2019 record ስለዚህ እነኚህ ተጨማምረው almost $10 billion ነው ኢትዮጵያ ውስጥ የሚገባው የሚቀንሰው ማለት ይሄ ዴቫስቴቲንግ ነው ለኢኮኖሚ እና ምናልባት ጠበቃ ደረጀ ስለዚህ ስለ ሬሚታንስ ላይ ትንሽ እንዴት አድርጎ እዛ ላይ ክሊርሊ ብታስረዳን አመሰግናለሁ
Go ahead.
Remittance specifically የሚጠቅስ አንቀጽ የለም ነገር ግን ፋይናንሻል ኢንስቲትዩሽኖች ናቸው ገንዘብ የሚያስተላልፉት ለምሳሌ ገንዘብ የሚተላለፍበት አንድ ዌስተርን ዩኒየን ሊሆን ይችላል ኢትዮጵያ ውስጥ ያለ ብራንች ኦፊስ ሊሆን ይችላል ወይም ደግሞ ከኢትዮጵያ ባንክ ጋር የተገናኘ ሊሆን ይችላል እና የተወሰነ ገንዘብ በዚህ መልኩ ለመንግስት እርዳታ ወይም ከጦር ኤፈርት ከወር ኤፈርት ጋር የተገናኙ ዳታዎች ይደርሳሉ የሚል ነገር ካለ እነዛ ፋይናንሻል ኢንስቲትዩሽኖች ገንዘብ የማስተላለፍ መንገዱን ሊዘጉት ይችላሉ ሁለተኛ የኦሬዲ ሬሚታንስ ለማስቆም ጥረት እየተደረገ በተጨማሪ ከዚህ ህግ በተጨማሪ ማለት ነው የቲፒኤልኤፍ ሎቢ ግሩፕ ኦሬዲ አናውንስ አድርጓል እየሰሩ እንደሆነ ያንን ለገንዘብ የመላክ ሬሚታንስ ወደ ኢትዮጵያ እንዳይሄድ ከዚህ ሀገር ስለዚህ ፕሮሰስ ወደዛ መከዱ የሚቀር አይመስለኝም ሁለተኛ በግሩፕ የሚላኩ ገንዘቦች ለነን ፕሮፊት ኦርጋናይዜሽኖች የሚሄዱ ገንዘቦች ለእርዳታ የሚላኩ ገንዘቦች በጎፋንድ የሚሰበሰቡ ገንዘቦች እነሱ የሚቆሙበት መንገድ በጣም የመቆም እድላቸው ከፍተኛ ከዚህ ህግ ጋር በተገናኘ ማለት ሶ መልሱ ስፔሲፊካሊ በዚህ ህግ ሬሚታንስን የሚያግድ አንቀጽ የለም ወደዛ ግን አተረጓጎሙ ሰፋ ባለ መልኩ ሄዶ ተወሰነ ገደብ ሊያመጣ ይችላል በተጨማሪ ደግሞ ኦሬዲ ሬሚታንስን ለማስቆም ስፔሲፊካሊ ጥረት እየተደረገ ነው እና ይሄ ሰክሲድ ካደረገ ህግ ወደዛ የሚቀጥለው ስቴፕ መሄዳቸው አይቀርም ያም ደግሞ የኢትዮጵያ መንግስት ይሄ ሳንክሽን ተደርጎበትም ያንገራገረ የሚቀጥል ከሆነ እንደ ተጨማሪ ሜጀር እንደሚወስዱት ምንም ጥርጥር የለኝም ስለዚህ ያን አይነት አደጋ አለ አመሰግናለሁ
እሺ አመሰግናለሁ
Oh, sorry. Okay. Zelwa, አይታያችሁ ፖስትድ አይደለም ይያሉና አንዳንድ ሰዎች አይታያችኋል?
See, it's there. Multiple posts are there.
Okay, multiple posts are there. That's very good. እና እኔ ጥያቄ አለ የመጣ ጥያቄ
ጋሽ በትሩ ጥያቄ አላቸው
ጋሽ በትሩ go ahead.
እሺ በጣም ግሩም ገለጻ ነው የተደረገልን አሁን ከተጠየቀው ጋር የተያያዘ ነው አንዳንድ ጎላ ብለው የማይታዩ ግን በደንብ ሲተነተኑ ወይ አናላይዝ ሲሆኑ ሰፋ ያለ ኢምፕሊኬሽን ያላቸው ነገሮች እንዳሉ ከአንዳንድ ወዳጆች ጋር ስንወያይ ተጠቆመ ነገር አለ ይሄም ኢሚግሬሽንን የሚመለከት አንድ በግሪን ካርድ ላይ ያለ ወይንም በቅርብ ጊዜ ከኢትዮጵያ ወደዚህ የመጣ ሰው የሚያደርገው አክሽን ቦዝ ቅድም አተርኒ ደረጀ እንዳለው ገንዘብ በመላክ ያ ገንዘብ ላለዋለ ምናምን በሚለው በሌላ በኩል ደግሞ በዚህ በፍሪደም ኦፍ ስፒች በሚወስነው ነገር ላይ በሚናገረው በሚጽፈው ነገር ላይ ጦርነቱን የሚረዳ ነገር አድርጓል ተብሎ ከተተረጎመ ያ ስታተሱን አፌክት የሚያደርግ እርምጃ ሊወሰድበት እንደሚችል ይሄ የእኛን ኮሚኒቲ በጣም ሊጎዳ የሚችል ነገር ዳያስፖራው ማለት ነው። ብዙ ጊዜ አይወራም ይሄ። ስለዚህ ብዙ አልተነጋገርንበትም። ሌላው አሁን ደረጀ ጠቆም ያደረገው ነገር ብዙ እርዳታ ዳያስፖራው ለኢትዮጵያ እንደሚልክ የታወቀ ነው። እኔ ብዙ እርዳታ ድርጅቶች ውስጥ እሳተፋለሁ። መድኃኒት እንልካለን። ይሄ ዱዋል ዩዝ የሚባለው መድኃኒቱ ኢትዮጵያ ከገባ በኋላ ለምን እንደሚውል ኮንትሮል የለንም። የቆሰለ ወታደር ሊታከምበት ይችላል፣ ወይም የወለደች እናት ልትታከምበት ትችላለች። እና ይሄ በጣም ሰፊ የሆነ ኢምፕሊኬሽን ያለው መሆኑ ግንዛቤ ብያዝ ጥሩ ነው ለማለት ነው። የአፋርን እርዳታ በሚመለከት ሪሊ ሁላችንም መረባረብ አለብን። በሌላም ድርጅት በኩል የጀመርነው እንቅስቃሴ አለ። በቅርቡ ቀን ምናልባት ከግሌን ጋር ማጣመር ይቻል እንደው እንነጋገራለን። እሱን ኦፍላይን ግን በጣም በጣም ኢምፖርታንት ነው። ብዙ ችግር እየደረሰባቸው ስለሆነ ይህንንም እንደው ላሰምርበት ፈልጌ ነው።
ታንክ ዩ ፕሮፌሰር ቢኒያ።
Okay, thank you for the opportunity. ትንሽ እህታችን ሀናዊ ያቀረበችልንና አቶ አቡባከር ደግሞ በአፋር ያለው ሁኔታ ስላስተማሩን በጣም አመሰግናለሁ። ሀናዊ ችግራችን ብለሽ ነው የጀመርሽው። እውነቱስ የሁላችን ችግር ነው። ያልተቆረቆረ ሰው የለም እና በጣም ነው የሚሰማን። አቶ አቡባከር ያወጡት አንዳንድ ነጥቦች በጣም በጣም መሰማት ያለባቸው አሉ። ይህ የእሳቸው ሐሳብ ሳይሆን የአፋር ህዝብ አቤቱታና ጥያቄ ነው። ስለዚህ ትንሽ ዛሬ የተገናኘነው ኢትዮጵያኖች በጋራ ለህዝባችን ስንል እንድንሰራ ዩኒቲ አንድነት እንድንፈጥር ነው እና ለምንድን ነው አንድ ያልሆነው የሚለውን እኮ ማሰብ አለብን። ከዚህ 4 ወር 5 ወር በፊት ይሄ ጥያቄ አልነበረም። አንድ አይደለንም፣ አንድ እንሆን፣ ለምንድን ነው ሆድና ጀርባ የሆነው ብለን አልተነሳንም። ስለዚህ አንዳንድ የፖለቲካ ጥያቄዎች ህብረተሰብ የሚያቀርቡት partly is one of the reasons። አሁን ለምሳሌ በአፋር ክልል አቶ ያሲን ሀቢብ የጤና ኃላፊ ናቸው ሲያስረዱ ከ2 ወር በፊት ማለት ነው ከ77 ጤና health centers bureaus health centers ጠቅላላ ዲስትሮይ ተደርጎ በቲፒኤልኤፍ ማለት ነው የቀሩት 5 ነው የጀመሩት። 8 ነው የጀመሩት ከ77 8 ከ8 ውስጥ ደግሞ አንድ 4 የሚሆን የአዲስ አበባ ከተማ አስተዳደር ሜዲካል ኢኩዊፕመንት የተለያየ በማገዝ 2ቱ ደግሞ የተረፉት የሐረር በማገዝ። ስለዚህ ያለው ውድመት ያለው ዲስፕሌስመንት ያለው ችግር በጣም ከፍተኛ ነው። the lack of support is really remarkable። ስለዚህ ያስፈልጋል ይሄ support። በአማራ ክልል 4000 ትምህርት ቤቶች 2400 የጤና ጣቢያዎች 2.3 ሚሊዮን displaced አሁን ድርቅ እየመጣ። ስለዚህ ወደ ማዕቀብ ስንመለስ ማዕቀብ የኛ ህዝብ ሁሉም የኛ ህዝብ ናቸው። ትግራይ ውስጥ እየተራቡ ናቸው። የኛ ህዝብ ማዕቀብ ያንን ጥያቄ ሊመልስ ይችላል ወይ? of course ሊመልስ አይችልም ማዕቀብ። ስለዚህ መደረግ ያለበት የፖለቲካ ስራ ይደረጋል። ግን ይህ ማዕቀብ የበለጠ ጉዳት ያመጣል እንጂ የሚረዳ ነገር አይደለም። ግን በዚህ በተመለከተ በአፋር ክልል በአማራ በተለያዩ ኢትዮጵያ ክልሎች የሚጎሳቆሉና really suffer የሚያደርጉት መርዳት አለብን እና አቶ አቡባከር ሀናዊ በጣም እናመሰግናለን።
Thank you so much. Mr. Lawrence Freeman, you have the floor now. You can unmute yourself.
Hello.
Hello.
Can you hear me okay?
Very much so.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you tonight. What I wanted to emphasize in my analysis of these 2 bills is the real target is the sovereignty of Ethiopia. Aside with all the particulars, which are not unimportant, the main purpose is to badger and threaten Ethiopia with the loss of the control of the government if they don't follow the dictates coming from the geopolitical establishment in Washington. Very relevant to this is to look at the tweet from Senator Coons after the bill, the S3199, was passed last Tuesday. And I believe he made, this is very explicit and should be clear to everybody. He said, I voted for this legislation because if Ethiopia does not do what we want, then we will pass it. And if they do what we want, it won't go anywhere. That's the key. The point is to weaken the central government of the elected Prime Minister, Abiy Ahmed, and to promote ethnicity to the extent of working out some relationship. I believe there's going to be some attempt to bring the TPLF back into government in some form, not in control the way they had before, but some prominent way that they can help, they believe they can influence policy in the new government. And my concern is that the government of Ethiopia, who I spent some time trying to talk to when I was there last December, they don't understand what the attacks are. The sanctions are horrible. Sanctions are evil. Sanctions will cause more poverty. They will cause more instability. They will cause more ethnic rebellions. So there's no useful purpose to sanctions. And it's very sad that my country, a great power, all we've been reduced to is sanctions against countries all over the world. And I find this foreign policy of the United States pathetic and really impotent, because as a great power, we should be developing relations with countries that promote the common interest of all our people. As I said, there's a political strategy coming from what I would call the oligarchical political establishment or geopolitical establishment. They want to make sure that there's no independent leadership in the Horn of Africa, because this is one of the most important areas in the world, from the Indian Ocean to the Gulf of Eden to the Red Sea to the Suez Canal. Very few more, I don't know, there's maybe one other important waterway as great as this, maybe the Straits of Malacca. And therefore, they don't want Ethiopia, together with Eritrea and Somalia, determining independent policy. And they will weaken the government. And I'm not sure the government understands this is the strategy. And this is the strategy of the Biden administration. This is the strategy of Anthony Blinken in the State Department. And I don't think people should be fooled to think there's a separate policy in the Congress different from the executive branch. And again, this is very clear to me, because who is Chris Coons? He is Biden's #1 closest colleague in the US Senate. And you will all remember, he was the one that was first sent over as an envoy, especially from Biden, early last year to meet with the Prime Minister. So my concern is that the government is going to be caught off guard and not understand what's really being thrown at them. And it won't stop. As the speakers have eloquently pointed out already tonight, there was no proof of genocide, never has been. There was no proof of ethnic cleansing, never has been. And there was no proof of rape as a weapon. And this was actually refuted by the UN itself, by UN workers on the ground. So why are these charges there? Why are they still being floated around? Why are they in both these bills? Because they're used as a means to control and threaten the Ethiopian government. You do what we say, or we will pass these legislations. I happen to think S3199 is more dangerous because it's written as a bill, not a resolution. And therefore, if it's passed, it would be an act of law. Now, both legislations would have to be passed by both houses. They each have to go to the next house, and they would have to be signed by Biden. But as the speakers pointed out, this is entirely under the control of the Democratic Party, who controls both houses. And therefore, it's under the control of President Biden. So Biden should receive some pressure, as well as both Pelosi and Schumer. But the most important thing to me is understanding the strategy. They're trying to force the Prime Minister to submit to their policy, and they won't stop. It will continue because they want to control the Horn of Africa. And therefore, Ethiopia may have to consider a realignment of its foreign policy, not to dismiss the United States. We have to force the United States to behave properly, but to prepare for life after sanctions and working with other countries around the world and other countries in Africa. Because the most important contribution Ethiopia has made before this conflict was the economic vision it had with the GERD, with the railroad, with eliminating poverty, with building infrastructure. These are the things that I value the most in physical economy. And this is what Ethiopia has to begin planning for, even under the threats that are coming from the United States. So those are my contributions to your discussion tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Lawrence Freeman. That was really very powerful, and also reminding us that there is hope in what people are doing there. That's really very, very powerful. There's a question, but it's kind of related to what you just said. But it's to Binyam, but I think anyone can answer that. It says the U.S. may have a hidden agenda to pressure the Ethiopian government under the pretext of human rights and democracy. So what is that? What else is that other than what we just talked about? What else is the U.S. really wanting that it's going through all this to do what it is doing right now? And that's a question from two people. So you can jump on. Lawrence Freeman, if you look like you want to answer that, you can answer that. And also Binyam, you can jump on that too.
If as I said, there's been for quite a while, there's an establishment, and there's a geopolitical ideology of control. And this is one of the reasons we declare China as an enemy when it's not. We can declare Russia as an enemy when it's not. A lot of our foreign policy is governed by the fact that the geopolitical theory is we have to remain on top in the West. We set the rules. We have the rules-based order. You will do it our way, and we will have no one acting differently. This governs some parts of Western policy. In the Horn of Africa, the most dangerous place for the geopolitical strategy or doctrine, ideology, is Ethiopia, because it governs the whole Horn of Africa, 115 million people. And therefore, they can't have a leader with independence. They can't have a leader who does what he thinks is right for his country, but not what the geopoliticians want. And therefore, the government is going to be under continued threat for a while to come until we change that policy. And during that period of time, the most important thing from my standpoint is that the government understands that. There's nothing Ethiopia can do to make peace with this faction. We have to defeat these bills. I think your group and the other groups I've been working with have been very diligent and doing a good job. I think targeting the Biden administration and targeting Pelosi and Schumer is very good. But I think it's also important to realize what's motivating this policy and be prepared for looking at different avenues of foreign and domestic policy that provide for the sovereignty of Ethiopia and the progress and development of its people while these attacks are going on.
Thank you, Mr. Freeman. Binyam, did you want to say something?
I was just going to add, that's really a grateful insight, in terms of the way that we can think about it. For many of us, I've lived in the United States since I was 4, go back and forth to Ethiopia. I've lived in different countries. Even from a biographical perspective, aside from just reading about it and understanding it, this is the only country that is really an empire. And we have to understand the historical moment that we're in, which is really remarkable, which is almost equivalent to the British Empire and the British Empire World War II, in which you had this, what's called a hegemonic transition, a transition period where a great power is no longer a great power, economically, politically, militarily. And so how do they actually come and become a normal country? What we're facing as a country in the United States is that very question. How are our foreign policy elites, political elites coming to terms with reality, the economic rearrangement of the world, et cetera? And so in this context, the position of Ethiopia, excuse me one second. So in this context, the position of Ethiopia, we should really think about it as a analogous to perhaps not really being about Ethiopia at all, right? Which might be very kind of surprising to you. But I think let's look at, for instance, the case of Ukraine. The entire policy now around sanctions, using that as a tool, but the two countries that are like Siamese twins, which are being attempted to be separated, are Russia and China. The equivalent in the Horn of Africa, very interesting Siamese relationship, is Eritrea and Ethiopia. One of the demands that the US has is for this relationship, which is about a security relationship to create peace, a new vision for the Horn of Africa in terms of regional policy, foreign policy. One of the demands is for the US is for this to be ended and for Eritrea to be seen as an enemy again officially by Ethiopia. So that's one aspect of it, and I would suggest that I find it bewildering because the current government of Ethiopia is actually very liberal, very amenable to the West economically, politically, and yet they have been facing the wrath of God, so to speak, in terms of the fire and the pressure that's been put on them. And so it's not about the Ethiopian government and what it can do. It's about the political calculations that are being made. And so the US government does not care about Tigray. It doesn't care about the TPLF. As long as it can make Ethiopia into a vassal state, one that is not independent and has an independent policy of its own, then its political objectives will be met, whether that is through some mechanism, for instance, of having a diluted type of government, whether it's through perhaps breaking the central government and having them fall to their knees, so to speak, capitulate, or whether it's through destabilization and breaking up the country. So we really have to look at the experiences of other countries that have faced similar situations to understand how a great power like the US is trying to deal with the evolving change, if you will, on a global level. And unfortunately, again, Ethiopia finds itself at a historical moment, just like in the League of Nations and the transition that was happening during that time. And so that's the way I would think about kind of how the US is behaving and acting, and how it is not simply about elections and the sanctity of elections or human rights and so on.
Thank you. I just want to remind you, please take the phone numbers, like we said, of Congress and the Senate, and please call. I know we get together and we discuss and we have, loft ideas, but we do have to show some action. So I implore you to do that. And I'd also like to say that we have one person, and she has already contributed $500 to the Zelle account. And I don't know if somebody would like to match her. Other than that, or whatever amount that you want to do. So I just want to encourage you to do that. Okay. Mesfin, did you want to say something? Yes. Namen. Welcome.
Thank you.
Welcome. Oh, just before, I'm sorry, I didn't say who the name was. It's Nina who did that. She gave $500 to the Zelle account. Okay, thank you. Go ahead, Namen.
Yeah.
Welcome.
Thank you, Wasi. First, I would like to thank all the speakers, the presenters. Highly informative presentation. Thank you very much all. And Mr. Lawrence Freeman, as usual, I follow your articles and presentations. Excellent. Thank you so much. But I have to put a proviso about this. Some of you, including Mr. Freeman, have emphasized the geopolitical agenda of the US in the Horn of Africa. I agree, this is one major driver. But if we don't put matters in perspective, meaning why the US Congress and US State Department, the White House are acting the way they are acting, it's due to several other drivers that we have to recognize, and those have to be factored in in our strategy, including our engagement with the US Congress. Otherwise, we'll be in paralysis mode. While the geopolitical agenda and drive is a major factor, we have to recognize that we as a community are not organized. And as most of you know and encountered, a lot of these congressmen and senators are not informed. While the TPLF machinery in the diaspora is highly organized, they have the space to disinform continuously, number one. Number two, they have the lobbying power and the financial resources to give to the senators and congressmen. So all this policy making, lawmaking, is also driven by financial interest, election interest, lobbying power, etc. So unless we put this as a major driver as well, it means that we're going to leave our fate to be determined by a kind of perspective that would kind of imprison us to act. So the relevance of this meeting today, we have to unite and we have to act. It is well-known fact that the majority of congressmen and senators are not informed because we have not done our work, our homework, well, properly, and with the financial resources. Of course, the unity factor is there. Since January, there's a lot of disenchantment and opposition to some of the government actions as well as inactions, including, as we heard today, from our Afar brothers and sisters. However, we have also heard tonight the devastating consequence of these sanctions. So there is only one thing we can do. However, we analyze it. Unless we act, it's going to be analysis paralysis. So we should organize more effectively in each and every city, mobilize our friends and family and colleagues and goodwill Americans, willing friends, and engage directly, meet with senators and congressmen, inform them. And this works because they want our vote, they want our financial support. We have not done that adequately and robustly. AIPAC has been trying to do that, but more to be done. There needs to be more to be done. So I'm urging all of you, brothers and sisters, to really, I think it's time to act. We have not done as much as we should do. This is the only thing we can do. We have to organize, engage, and try to influence all the senators and congressmen in each and every district where we are at. Phone calls and letters and campaigns are good, but they are not enough. We have to take an appointment, continuously engage and engage and engage relentlessly with each and every senator. When we can do that only by organizing with AIPAC. So this is very important. The other dimension we have to understand, again, it is very important why the US policymakers are acting the way they're acting is because of public opinion. And this public opinion has been shaped, false narratives by CNN and other mainstream media. And why? Because the TPLF during 27 years of tenure and impunity, it put all of its functionaries in international media, international organizations, and it has the connections and the relationship that has been built. So all these factors and variables have to be seen in context and together in order to understand why is the US acting. So my point, there are many drivers. We have to understand these drivers, and we have a leverage point. Our leverage point is organizing our community well and robustly and engage our senators and congressmen, build on what AIPAC has started, Green and AIPAC and this coalition has started. Unless we do that, unless we aggressively do that, this bill, draft bill, becomes a law, and you have heard, and I'm not gonna repeat, the consequences and the devastating impact. It will weaken Ethiopia, it will weaken our people, but it will strengthen the divisive, destructive, disuniting forces like TPLF, OLF, and others. Thank you.
Thank you. Masfin, did you want to say a comment?
Yeah. So action items. Number one is please call the Senate leaders. The Senate is our best option to stop this regulation from being enacted. So Senator Inhofe's office is given on the chat. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, Senator Round's office. These are Republican senators who potentially can put a stop on this bill, and so please call them. Action item number 2 is let's just call the House leader, Nancy Pelosi's office, everybody from every corner of the country. These are national leaders, and make sure that she hears from every one of us that's we object, and this is not good for either the United States or Ethiopia in the long term. So please, you have a Nancy Pelosi's number, and please call her. We have to engage our local senators and congressmen, like Naaman said, but at this point, let's just do our best to do with senators like Senator Warner as much as possible. Let's just, we haven't given up on the Democratic side of the aisle, so let's just do our best to convince that this is not to their interest to do this. When AGOA was taken out, when Ethiopia was delisted from AGOA, the next day, there was a $300 billion plan rolled out by the Chinese. And even from selfish American interest point of view, there is a different world we will live. This is not going to be of any benefit to the United States. So call these leaders, send letters, and more importantly, we are going to have an organized fundraising activities to different key decision makers, and we'll get it out through, you'll get it through from us through different means. Please participate. Let's get organized. We have made already an impact. People know that now we are getting organized. People know that we have made a difference in Virginia. We are being contacted to talk to the lieutenant governor of the state because they really want to understand if we did actually, because they still are surprised that all of a sudden the Ethiopian American voice matters. So we are getting attention, but we cannot sleep. The other side is organized. The other side is not sleeping. They just passed some resolution in Georgia House. It's nominal, but nevertheless, it's a huge propaganda machine. Their propaganda machine has used it to tell their story. Our group has passed a resolution in Kentucky, very impressive resolution, pro-Ethiopia resolution. The Kentucky House has passed it. We are going to put together a very good announcement, publicize it properly. And in every state, all of us have to get engaged. There is absolutely no opportunity, no chance. If we care for Ethiopia, if we want to see the Ethiopia that we know to continue, guys, there is no option but to get engaged. So please, last but not least, let's just donate to our brothers and sisters in Afar. The Zelle number is listed as 614-615-4880. And for those of you who rather do it directly, there is a commercial bank account that's posted. And let's just please show our love, concern to the Ethiopians that are now paying disproportionate penalty for this war. All right, Wasi, back to you.
Thank you, Masfin. So there's still a few more comments coming. IU is next.
It's from Lenny, actually. She said that she knows that the discussion is about sanction today, but if there any way to educate our public about engaging in local politics, because this is new for Ethiopians, and we are kind of running after fire, once something is happening. So if is it EPAC or, people should can you answer to that question? Like, how to teach people, what do they get to learn about how to involve in local politics? That's the question.
I will let Mesfin come back and answer this question, but there's one thing I do want to comment. This thing is being heard by Facebook and everywhere. So it's an education moment, not just for the 136 people here, but everywhere. So this is a very good question. Go ahead, Mesfin.
All right, thank you. I think that's a great question. Now, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, there are 21 state committees across the United States that are organized to mobilize Ethiopians for the midterm election. Now, this group is working and looking to get engaged, is trying to get all Ethiopians in those different states engaged. We will post, I think if we have not already posted it, it will be posted on the website. We will also circulate an email back to everyone who is in our list to see who the contact is for a particular state, so that they can engage. What we'll ask is, we have created the infrastructure, but we really like everyone to get engaged. It's just something that we have to do. So for the answer for this question is, we'll post. We have an infrastructure in place already, and we are waiting for people to sign up, get engaged, and then do what needs to be done to be part of a solution.
Yeah. So one more point, and Gannat's reminded us of that. Gannat will say that it's not just these congressmen, the ones that and senators that we named for you, but your local congressman, you need to also talk to them also. So that means I'm supposed to talk to my congressman and to Pelosi and to Schumer. So that's why we need to do it in every state. Make sure you talk to the people that represent you also. That's a good point. The other thing I want to say is, because we talked about, people are saying, are there lobbyists and why don't we have a lobbyist? And others are saying we need money for lobbyists. So AIPAC hired a lobbyist. But the thing is, people need to support that. We need to fundraise. We need to give money for that. And I know when we talk about fundraising and dollars, right now, there's so much happening in Ethiopia that we want to support those efforts too. But this is what I say, and I sincerely believe that. We have to support the people of Ethiopia that are now in dire need. That's something we have to do. That's a must. But we also have to support an organization like AIPAC, because that's the organization that's going to help us to go to across the cross to victory. Because if we do not do that, then we cannot be, then we won't be effective. The other day we were looking at all these donations that were made to these congressmen by the TPLF. I mean, I was depressed. I mean, $50,000 here, $40,000 here, $10,000 here. That's the money that the Wayane have been throwing around. And when you look at all of that, you say, oh my God, where can we begin? How can we begin? But even for us to begin and do things strategically, we need funds. We need dollars. So I think I'm really appealing to you to go ahead. There's the AIPAC, the website, somebody can put it over there. Go ahead and do that. And I know, it's just a question of how do you budget, because that's something I'm dealing with right now too. I put this much for this thing and this much for that. I think we need to do that. We need to take action. It's just so very, very important.
Yes, Wasi, I see a question here also, something to the effect of the Ethiopian government need to hire a lobbyist from one of the, so we agree with that comment. This is also something that the government needs to take very seriously. There is an effort from what we heard. There is an effort by the Ethiopian government to hire a lobbyist as well. They understand that this is a serious issue, and then we hope that will materialize. And then in addition to what we do, because as citizens of this country, what we can contribute is much stronger than just a lobbyist organization working for a foreign government. So although that's important, they need to do that, but that doesn't change the fact that we have to work hard. We have to come together, we have to fund campaigns. We have to fund some really lobbying and certain PR activities within our framework. And then that augmented with what the Ethiopian government must do, we may have a chance to come alive out of the situation.
Thank you. There's yes, go ahead.
There was one question that came my way. Can we organize a powerful talking point / message? That's a good question.
And we do have those. I mean, we can just contact APAC. We do have a lot of talking points, and we will get it to you. So all of you just go ahead, if you find it on the website, you find it. Otherwise, go ahead and ask us and you will get it. There's one very important question here that...
put the APAC email here, direct email. Masfin, you should put your direct email here so everybody can get through you. Masfin, you and Wasi.
Okay.
So they can contact you.
Okay. Okay, this is a very... Okay, I will do that. I just want to read this question. And it's I think a very critical question. Is it true that HR 6600 is a blanket sanction, but 3199 have humanitarian exceptions and waiver under section 9A, 2B, and C? It says U.S. will continue providing aid for basic life savings. So this is a very, very important question. So I would really encourage maybe Daraja to start with this question, or yeah, if you're here, you still go ahead.
ደረጀ እዛ ላይ እንደገና አንድ ጥያቄ ጨምሮ ይመልስ if he's there. Is there
okay? If Daraja is not there, we'll start with
Binyam, maybe.
Binyam, yeah.
I think he sent a message that he's dropping off at.
Okay, Binyam, are you there? Yeah, Binyam is there.
Okay, so on top of what you asked, like there are some questions came our way, and Kalalai actually reworded. Why can't Ethiopia bring the issue of sanctions to the UN Security Council as a security threat to the country, as Egyptians did Ethiopians when building GERD?
Okay, so two questions. Go ahead, Binyam, and then others can jump in too with that.
Okay, so there's generally in sanctions, there's two distinctions. And one of the distinctions is something called targeted sanctions. And the idea of targeted sanctions is it's meant to be like a very sharpened tool as opposed to a blunt instrument. So it's going to cut you in places where you want, which that means is that for unilateral sanctions like the US, they develop targeted sanctions that are meant to not attack or target the civilian population, that is not going to hurt the poor, that is not going to, for instance, have a negative public health effect with the lack of medicines and et cetera that we're going to see. So that's the idea behind the development and design of targeted sanctions. So this has been designed for Syria, this has been designed for Nicaragua, for Venezuela, for Iraq, for Iran. And so targeted sanctions still are targeting and hurting the general population. So the dynamics that I talked about the effects of sanctions and how they really are impacting an entire society still hold for targeted sanctions as well. So that's the first thing to understand. The second thing to understand is that the total sanctions package, as you see it now, is meant to actually make poverty elimination, the access and availability of public health in Ethiopia. Think about what we're talking about here. So in Amara Killil, for instance, we're looking at 3,400 health facilities that have been destroyed by the TPLF. Who's going to rebuild them? It's the central government. So we have a program in Ethiopia, very robust government institutions, no matter how dysfunctional they may be at times, but nevertheless, they provide public health, they provide public education, development, poverty alleviation. And so the entirety of the sanctions that you see here is designed to make opening a business, doing business in Ethiopia, a very risky proposition, is to make Ethiopia sort of isolated from the international economy as well. So the humanitarian aspect is that because of the devastating effects of sanctions, where you will have people that will be in dire straits, lack of food, lack of medicine, etc. You have humanitarian organizations then that are going to be predominantly players and providers of these things, which we ourselves can do. So targeted sanctions hurt, and they hurt just as equally. They do not do what they claim. And secondarily, the sanctions we're talking about, even with this exception, humanitarian exception that is in there, is not going to actually benefit the Ethiopian people. It would still have that same detrimental effect, right? Basically setting the economy afire. You can think about the price of goods and services in Ethiopia, how that's going to increase. Transportation, how that's going to increase because of fuel. Food that's being imported. What's the price of food going to be, and oil, etc. So that's one aspect. The other thing regarding bringing these issues to the UN, and just very quickly, I think in that statement about targeted sanctions, arguably have the right to pass. The US can pass anything it wants. Any country can pass anything it wants, right? But to act on it has to be on the basis of law. And so the key issue that is being raised at an international level today, a key point of discussion in the United Nations, is that sanctions, unilateral coercive measures are illegal. They're against international law. And countries, no matter how strong, cannot do them. So that's a very sort of clear position that is consistent with the UN Charter. The US does not have the right to put sanctions on Ethiopia. Can we bring, hypothetically, to the UN? Yes, one can bring to the UN, but the UN is not a democratic institution. It's going through reform, and there's calls for reform, and not simply about representation on the Security Council. So the Security Council essentially are the victors of World War II. And so any question that is brought before the Security Council becomes a question of politics, right? And so you can bring questions of sanctions, and very easily it will be slapped down, will not go anywhere, right? So in the context of Ethiopia over the past year, we've noted that there's a consistent principle by the Russians, by the Chinese and others, that the question of peace and stability in Ethiopia is a domestic issue. The sovereignty of Ethiopia has to be respected, not because that Ethiopia is lovable from the Russian or Chinese perspective, but based upon the UN Charter principle. If sovereignty is not respected of this country, it can happen to any country and be violated. And so I think that's the spirit in which I can answer that question, which is that bringing it to the UN may not necessarily result in anything. And I'll just say one last thing regarding action. And this is one of the things that I'm very concerned about. And I hope those that are in Ethiopia are listening. AIPAC has done a marvelous job to rally, to build an infrastructure, and to work as a non-political organization that is working to upkeep the interest of Ethiopia in general, sovereignty, etc. Okay, so that is what's happening in the diaspora, educating the public, mobilizing the public, and then acting both in the interest of Ethiopia and in the United States as well, of the U.S. society. So the actions that is required is also in Ethiopia. And the most important entity in Ethiopia, of course, the people are the most important, but in terms of institutions, is the government. The government needs to think about responses to possible sanctions, the plans that are necessary in case this happens, right? So planning and actions that are required are very important. They're also, at least in New York, we're attempting various civic organizations in New York. There are many countries that are experiencing sanctions that are part of this drive within the UN to outlaw illegal coercive sanctions. And so Ethiopia is not alone. Eritrea is not alone. There are many countries representing at least 60% of the global population that are against the use of coercive unilateral sanctions against any country. So diplomatically, we are not isolated. Ethiopia can and has to do outreach in order to tap into this diplomatic support available as well. So that is some activities, I think, from the government side that is very important, Ethiopian government, which is you have a very much goodwill, and you have international law on your side, etc. So I know it's very simplistic because there's much more in terms of the decision making that a government has to make, but I think it's just something that I like to pass on, that we in the diaspora are not paid, do not have any positions, have no axe to grind, are simply working for the benefit of all Ethiopians. And so those that are paid, it's their job to make sure that Ethiopia's rights and privileges are protected, should plan accordingly, particularly if this thing is going to pass. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I know this has been a very exciting and full event. So if there's no more questions or I think, or comments, I think, Masoud, do you want to close this out?
Yes, I think there is also a question regarding how the No More movement can help this. Maybe Hermela, would you mind to make a comment with that on that?
Yes, somebody read my mind. I'd actually turn on my camera and turn on my mic. Yeah, so what I asked Wasi on the chat, I'm sure we'll talk later, about sending me this recording so I can pull quotes, because I think there was a lot of things that were said that's really poignant. I forget who was just talking, but I couldn't even keep up. I was trying to type up what you were saying, but I can't get the perfect quotes, but I'll get it from the recording. I think that, you know, what we've learned from stuff like this is we just got to do the work for people in terms of understanding, and that's okay. You know, like Wasi said, most people aren't reading the bill, whether they support or not. So yeah, so that's what we'll do. And we launched the hashtag Break the Silence campaign yesterday, all month of April. You know, we've all agreed we have been slipping on some things in terms of giving enough attention to different issues, Afar being one of them. And we've been able to really regroup. A lot of people have been meeting to be able to find a streamlined way to do that. So I think this is one way to do that. So just look out for that. And then somebody will create a link tree so that we could put those in somewhere where people can just share. But the other thing is, if you are on Twitter, feel free to just copy and paste someone's tweet. I mean, you don't have to come up with it. So there'll be a lot of stuff on the sanctions and what they mean from this. And then also just highlighting specific issues on Afar. So look out for that. Even if it's just on Facebook, I think it's just worth sharing. But definitely if you're on Twitter, please look out for that and use the hashtag, because I hate how much impact that social media has, but it does. It's the only space we can go that's not fully censored, although sometimes we get taken down. And so I think that we just have to use that tool for as long as we have it. So we'll be doing that. Thanks.
Thank you. I mean, I don't know who Ebai is, but you can put your question in the chat, and then we can answer it. We can have someone answer it for you. Other than that, okay.
Dr. Eba.
Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead, Dr. Eba.
Go ahead, unmute yourself.
Thank you for allowing me to speak. Hopefully I'm not the last speaker, but this is my first time to attend this meeting. So I've been involved in Atlanta local efforts. So I would like to make maybe about 3 comments on how to go forward. It's great that we discuss the issues, the legislations and all that kind of stuff. But definitely, number one, we're losing the PR front. So how do we go about reclaiming that narrative that we're also the victims, and people who victimize us are portraying themselves as victims. So we have to strategize, number one, for the PR campaign. Number two, I'm sorry to say, I'm not trying to be offensive. We have a lot of Ethiopian organizations, APAC, Glean, and all that stuff. Just being from the outside, why don't we all work together? Not that you're not working together, but have a division of labor. Let's say APAC would do the lobbying effort. Maybe Glean can do something different that they're good at. Like Hermela and No More are very good at mobilizing the activism and grassroots work. So having one umbrella organization or entity to direct everybody's effort instead of duplicating and replicating what we're doing. Have a division of labor, because I mean we have to work as a group, as an entity, because we have a formidable enemy. It's not about truth. It's not about what is right. It's about how they portray themselves. And lastly, we have to be good at getting others in our corner, our people who are connected, decision makers, not just the politicians. For my part, I'm trying to recruit people with money and influence to be on our side, because we're not good at that, because we are late in the game and we're trying to do the catch up. So my comment and my suggestion to all of us, for people to contribute, we have to give them a reason to contribute and to be part of it. So when we get united, have a strict agenda and very clear working relationship, then people will support us. And lastly, I know I said lastly, but just lastly, there are people, even in Atlanta, I'm sure everywhere in the States, there are people who are disgruntled. They have real issues that should be mentioned and addressed. The Amara situation, the Afar situation. So if we gloss over it, and our division is going to be even wider. So maybe a collective statement that we feel your pain, everybody should be living in peace, a statement to that effect, so we cannot stay divided. Thank you.
Thank you. So yeah, I think in APAC and Glean, we're all here. I mean, we do work together. We do exactly what you wanted us to do. So, but there may be others that we can all work together with. My thing is, I really feel we do talk about, I mean, especially now, we are talking about what's happening with Afar and what's happening with Amara, because it's all our issue. But there is a section that we're really not able to get through to. I really feel, and when I say that, and that's a section that's supporting HR 6600, I mean, how suicidal can that be? When you read it, when you look at it, how suicidal is that? Supporting S3199. How suicidal is that? So that is, I think, something we have to deal with, because I'm thinking it's the anger, it's the disappointment, it's, I don't like Abiy and I don't care what happens. And what they say back home, I don't care what happens, as long as they can get rid of him for me, then I'm fine with it. And probably that might not even happen whether we have sanctions or not. So this thinking behind these people is what's really very, very perplexing to me, because it doesn't matter how disgruntled we are with the government, we're not disgruntled with Ethiopia. It's not Ethiopia we want to do away with. But what this is doing is doing away with Ethiopia. I am not even optimistic that if this bill passes and they get to do whatever it is they want to do, I don't even know if there is Ethiopia as we know it, to fight for. So to me, something as detrimental as this bill to be supported by Ethiopians, we have to find out what that is. I mean, we have to be able to communicate with them. I mean, for me, the simplest answer was people did not read the bill. They don't know it. That's why they're supporting it. But, that's ridiculous. But that's what I was thinking.
Yeah, just to add, to say a few words, Wasi, on what he just said. Dr. Eba, maybe will reach out to you on offline and go through what has been done. So I think most of the suggestions that you have suggested are in a way in place, in works at this point. So we'll just update you on those efforts. As far as next steps, we have spent about 3 hours and we have about still 124 people and a lot of people watching it online. I would like to ask that let's just make sure such meetings are not just meetings and then we walk away and it's just another show. Let's just make sure the action item is taken. Let's call those senators that we asked you to call. It's very important that the Senate is now put on check. Let's also make sure that we support the disadvantage amongst us. So I know we have also received an email, a text message from another group suggesting that we should have a separate fundraising activity for our brothers and sisters in Afar. We would love to do that. Thank you for the suggestion. We would coordinate that in the near future, and we'll just make sure that we, at least the Ethiopian Americans in the diaspora and all over the world, will do whatever support we can to help alleviate the situation that they are in. And we have, I think, Ida has her hands on. If we take one more question, and then maybe we should close it up, because we have kept people for about 3 hours.
Yeah, I guess are you still there, Ida? I think she left.
Yeah, she's here.
I'm here. I can't.
Go ahead.
I'm on mute. Okay. Thank you very much. It was very educational, very enlightening. And I know we will come out winning on the other side. So we just have to keep going. The only thing I'm asking is to differentiate all these good organizations from the ones that are not good. I'm not going to get into details. Please make sure that you're working with the government and you're certified and are, recognized by the Ethiopian embassy, some kind of certification. So people, when they give money, they know, well, I guess I'll talk for myself. Okay. So I know I'm giving to an organization that the money will be used where it should be used, because we have seen and heard a lot of different things on that subject matter. And I'm, with all respect due, I'm just saying you'll put a lot of people's mind at ease if you have some kind of certification or recognition by the Ethiopian embassy or Ethiopian government, and then where people can have access to that. I mean, can look at it.
So I'm assuming.
So this is in reference to the Afar fundraising, right, Ida?
I'm talking about all organizations, because there were some organizations that were not supposed to be collecting money. And there's something going on with the government, anyway, I don't want to, just to make yourself legal and acknowledged and recognized by the Ethiopian government, any organization, that's collecting money.
Right,
well, certification is a hard thing. I don't know, Musfin, if you're going to respond to that, because as APAC, I don't think it can be certified by the Ethiopian government, because we are working for Ethiopians here in America. So, But I do understand your question around rehabilitation work, whatever work you do in Ethiopia, somehow it needs to be recognized how you're doing it. But there are independent nonprofits working in Ethiopia also. So there are people that want to support them. So I really don't know. I understand what the problem is, but I really don't know how we can resolve that. I guess we have to see what our organization's doing, really do a little bit deep dive into their history and support them through that. Because I don't know if everyone can get a certification. I really don't know. I mean, I was in Ethiopia a few months ago, and I went all the way to Ataye, with this wonderful group from Canada, with ICNAS. And we've seen different kind of organizations. I mean, there are those that are, independent nonprofits also that are working there. So I personally would not say do that, but I would say dive deep into who you're supporting, understand what they're doing, have them send you things. That's how I would respond to that question.
Can I say something?
Yes, go ahead.
This is Kabal. Thank you so much. The previous speaker is quite right. The Ethiopian government has now put in place a rule that any organization, be it an NGO or anyone who would like to collect and support humanitarian assistance to any part of the country, has to be registered. This is a newly put in place, so she's quite right. It's okay for any group to raise money as long as it's registered by the Ethiopian government. I just want to throw that
thank you.
out.
Thank you. So this is something we have to digest and understand. So
So just to add one point, I mean, this is, I'm referring, we generally don't do fundraising events for causes. I mean, there are events that are organizations that do that. But this particular event for the Afar, for our brothers and sisters in Afar, is something that Hanawi or maybe even Hassan can tell us where the fund is going. I think it's going to a fund that's has been.
It's a recognized, yeah. It's a
recognized fund that has been in place for the last 15 years. Hey, Hanawi, can you make a comment, please?
Hanawi?
Yes, ምን ነበር?
ድርጅቱ የአፋር ድርጅት ምን አይነት እንደሆነ ኢትዮጵያ የምትልኩለት ሬኮግናይዝድ የሆነ ድርጅት ነው ወይ ነው?
ያ ባለፈው አፕዴት አድርጌያችሁ ነበረ እነሱ ምን እንደሚሰሩ ይሰማል?
ይሰማል። እና ባንክ አካውንቱም በኮመርሻል ባንክ
እነሱ ደግሞ የቆዩ ናቸው። ትናንት ምናምን እንትን ያለ አይደለም፣ እንትን ያለው አይደለም። 15 ዓመት 17 ዓመት እንደዚህ አይነት ስራ ላይ ነው ያሉት እና ታርጌት ይባላል እውቅና ያለው ድርጅት ነው። የሚሰራው በብዛት ደግሞ እንደዚህ በሴቶች ጉዳይ ነው። ሴቶች እንደዚህ ላይክ በሴቶች እንትን ላይ ነውና ብዙም ሆስፒታል አላቸው ከራሳቸው የሚረዱ የቆየ ነው። ላይክ ምንድነው ጥያቄው? ስፔሲፊክ የሆነ ጥያቄ አለ?
I guess recognized የሆነ ድርጅት መሆኑን ነው I think ያስረዳሽን ይመስለኛል። አካውንቱንም ሰተሻል እና እንደሱ ነው አሁን ያደረግነው የዘል ፋንድሬዘሩ ያንን ቼክ ቀጥታ እዛ ነው የሚገባው ኤክስፐዳይት ለማድረግ ነው እንደሱ ያደረግነው። ቀጥታ ምዛ ማስገባት ትችላላችሁ እና እሱንም እንትን ይላክልናል።
ደግሞ እዚህ ጋር ሁሉም ነገር ደግሞ ለሌላ ጊዜ ሌሎችንም ለመርዳት እንዲመች ለሁሉም ሰዎች ሌላ ጊዜ ሌሎች ወንድሞችም ለመርዳት እንዲመች ፕሩፍ እያመጣን አሁን ስልክ ለነሱ ስልክ ፕሩፍ ልካለው። እንደገና ደግሞ ምን እንደተሰራበት ያው አለ አይደል? ለኔም ለራሴ ደስ የሚለኝ እንደዛ ነው ሁሉ ነገር ሰው ሌላ ጊዜም ደግሞ እውነት የተቸገሩ ሰዎችንም ለመርዳት እንዲጠቅመን የመጀመሪያው ስቴፓችን ነው ዋናው ላይክ ሌሎችንም ለመርዳት እና እውቅና ያለው ድርጅት ነው። እነሱ ላይ ነው የሚላከው። ኤቭሪቲንግ ለእናንተ እልክላችኋለሁ።
ኦኬ ለጥፉት እንደገና ፕሊዝ። ታርጌት የሚባል ኦርጋናይዜሽን ነው ከነ ባንክ አካውንቱም ሁሉም አለ እዚህ ለጥፉት ፕሊዝ። እኛ የዘሉን ያደረገ target it's in the chat but whoever is posting it please repost it no melo or someone.
Wasi, can I just add something? Yes, I will post it in a second. I know you are pushing, but I think the important message here is, unity starts with each one of us. It's not always pointing to the government of Ethiopia, to what others are doing, but in Yarasachin, we should start understanding the big work, which is Ethiopia. Yes. There might be things that I don't like what APAC is doing, but the bigger picture is it's fighting for Ethiopia. So I think in common Yohona meetings, we repeat, always looking the other way to find a solution. Let's start from us, within us. Let's get along better to push this work. Because at the end of the day, TPLF is winning, whether we like it or not. Whether we think somebody's taking $100 out of our pocket, TPLF is winning. So I think from this meeting, I think we should come out with what are we doing to do better than what we didn't do yesterday. It's been a year and a half, and we should be winning right now. But it seems like we're backwards, 100 steps backwards. So I don't know how many people are here, 100 something. Let's just accept responsibility. Let's do what it takes to unite in this time. Let's hold off on our criticism and trust one organization to lead. That would be my message. And I'm sorry, a little bit intense because I might be a little bit passionate, but it needs to be said. Like, we need to get it. We all need to do what it takes at this time. There won't be any place to go. So, sorry, that's what I wanted to add.
Very good message. Hannah Tamirat, okay. Can unmute yourself.
Okay. ሰላም ብያለሁ። ይሰማል ድምጼ?
ይሰማል።
እሺ እኔ እንኳን ያለኝ መጀመሪያ ማመስገን ፈልጋለሁ። ጥሩ ትምህርት ሰጪ ጥሩ ጊዜ ነበረ። አንድ ጥያቄ ብቻ ነው ያለኝ። እሱም ይሄ በአፋር በኩል አሁን የሚሰበሰበው ለምን በእነዚህ እነሃዊ የሚሰሩ ስራ ጥሩ እንደሆነ ከነገረችኝ ተረድቻለሁኝ። ግን በቅርብ ጊዜ እዛ ሄጄ ነበርና አንዳንድ ችግሮችም አይቼ ነው የመጣሁት። ከዚህ ብር ሰብስበን ተከሄዶ በአካውንት ተሰጥቶን አካውንት ውስጥ አስገብተን እዛ ስንደርስ ግን ያጣንበትና ያዘንበት ነገሮች አሉና ከዛ በኋላም የእርዳታ ማስተባበሪያ ኮሚቴዎችንና የዲያስፖራ ኮሚቴውን አነጋግረን እነሱ ለምን በእኛ በኩል አልመጣችሁም? መጀመሪያ የጀመርነው በምን እንደዚህ በተሰማው ሰውና እንደዚህ ችግር አለ ብሎ በነገረን ሰው ነበረ እርዳታውን የጀመርነው። እዛ መሬት ላይ ስንሄድ ግን ያንን በማጣታችን በጣም አዝነን የተመለስነው። እንደዚህ አይነት ችግር እንዳይፈጠር ለሚቀጥለው ጊዜ የዲያስፖራው ተወካዩ የእርዳታ አስተባባሪው ሁለቱም ቁጭ አድርገው በስብሰባ በአዳራሽ ውስጥ አድርገው ነው የመከረው። በግለሰብ አካውንት ትራንስፈር አታድርጉ፣ ካረጋችሁ በእኛ በኩል እለፉ። ኢቨን ከነሱ ጋር አብሮ የሚሰራ ሰው በመንግስት ቢሮ ውስጥ በስልጣን ላይ ያለ ሰው እጁ የነበረበት ጉዳይ ነው። ያ ሰው ያንን አካውንት የሰጠን እዛው በመንግስት ቢሮ ውስጥ የሚሰራ ነው እና መጨረሻ ላይ ሞቅሰን የመጣ ነው። ለምን እንዲህ አይነት ሐሳብ ሲመጣ ከመንግስት ካለው አካል ጋር አላገናኛችሁም? ይሄን አካውንት ለምን በግል ሰጣችሁን የሚለውን ጥያቄ ጠይቀን ስቲል ፕሮሰስ ላይ ያለ ጉዳይ ነው። ስለዚህ እንደዚህ አይነት ችግር እንዳይፈጠር እኛ ከዚህ በላይ አብረን ለመቆም ከአፋር ህዝብ ጋር አብረን ነን ያለነው እና በሚያስፈልገው ነገር ለመርዳት አብረን ለመሆን ሁሌም ዝግጁ ነን ያለነው። እኔ ሄጄ ልቤ ተነክቶ አዝኜ ነው የመጣሁት። አይቼ ያለው ሆስፒታል ያለሁትንም ፔሸንቶቹንም አይቼ ነው የመጣሁት እና እንደ አይነት ችግር እንዳይፈጠር እዛ ያሉት ተጎጆች ትክክለኛውን እርዳታ እንዲያገኙ እንዲያው ከዲያስፖራ ተወካዩም ከእርዳታ አስተባባሪው ጋራም እንዲ ኮንታክት ያለው ነገር ቢሆን ጥሩ ነው። በግልም ማድረግ አይቻልም አይደለም፣ ግን እንዲያው ምን ያህል ከዚህ በፊት ካለኝ ኤክስፒሪየንስ ነውና ቴንክ ዩ ዋሲ።
Thank you. I think ትንሽ misunderstanding አለ። እኔ የተናገርኩት ለምሳሌ በአጠቃላይ አስተሳሰቤ ነው የተናገርኩት። ነገር ግን እነ ሀናዊ የሚሰሩት ቀጥታ የተመዘገበ ድርጅት 15 ዓመት በመንግስት የታወቀ ባንክ አካውንት ቀጥታ እዛ አለ። እኔ as a fundraising strategy አሁን እዚሁ በአንድ ጊዜ ሰው ወጥቶ ባንክ ጽፎ ብር አካውንት ብዙ ጊዜ አይከትም። እንግዲህ ተነጋግረን አሁን ስንጨርስ አዝኖ ቤቱ ይሄዳል። በሷ አካውንት ይገባል። ያን የገባውን ድምር ትወስድና ታስገባለች። ያንን ያስገባችበትን ሪሲት ለኛ ትልክልናለች እና እኛ ያንን አቬይለብል እናደርጋለን። እንደዛ ነው። ይሄ ስትራቴጂ በሷ ስም ያደረግነው እንጂ ኢንፋክት እሷ ይሄ ነው ያለው ድርጅቱ ናምላ በደንብ በሱ ነው እንትን ያለው። ግን አይ ኖ ፋንድሬዚንግ ላይ ሰው በጊዜው ኢሞሽናል ሲነካ ያደርጋል። ከዛ ቤቱ ሲሄድ ይረሳል እና ያ እንዳይሆን በማለት ይሄንን ስትራቴጂ ያወጣ ነው። ኦኬ አሁን ኢትዮ ኤሪትሪያን ታስክ ፎርስ
so wasi and ነገር እዚህ ላይ ለመጨመር ሃናዊና ከባዱን አንድ ስብሰባ እንዲገናኙና ዲስከስ እንዲያደርጉ አንድ ውይይት ቢያደርጉ ጥሩ ነው። የሚሰራበት መንገድ ካለ አሁን የሆነ ኮሜንት እሱን መስራት የሚቻልበት መንገድና ቀላል ማድረግ የሚቻልበት መንገድ ካለ እሱም an option ነውና will set a meeting for Hanawi Hassan እና our brothers and sisters from Afar ከከባዱ ጋር አንድ ግማሽ ሰዓት ስብሰባ አድርገው ኦፕሽኖችን ዲስከስ ቢያደርጉ ጥሩ ነውና will set that meeting up.
I agree. Thank you so much.
ይቅርታ እዚህ ጋር አንድ ነገር ልጨምርላሽ።
ቀጥል።
ቅድም የተናገረችው እህታችን በጣም ስሜታዊ ሆና ነው። በጣም ያማል። ለሆነ ለተቸገረ ሰው ለመርዳት ሁሉም ሰው መርዳት ይፈልጋል። ግን ችግሩ ብሩ እዛ ጋር ሳይደርስ ሲቀር ደግሞ ያው ሰው በቀላል አይደለም ፍራንክን የሚያገኙትና ልክ ናት ግን እዚህ ጋር አሁን እኔ ጋር የሚሰባሰበው ብር ሁላ I'm gonna make sure ለራሴም ለስሜም ስለማልፈልግ ሁሉንም ነገር በጸዳ ሁኔታ እናንተም ሁሉንም ነገር እንትን እንድታደርጉ ከኔ ጋር የሚገባውን ኃላፊነቱን እኔ መወሰድ እችላለሁ ማለት ነው ላይክ በዛ ስጋት ምንም አይነት ስጋት አይኑራችሁ እኔም ምኞቴ ላይክ እነዚህ ሰዎች ጋር መድረሱ ነው ምኞቴ because በመሃል ተጭበርብሮ ምናምን አሁን ይሄ ሰዎች በጣም የሚያሳዝን ሁኔታ ላይ ነው ያሉት so ለዛም ነው የኔም ትግልም ያንን ነው እነዚህ ሰዎች እዚህ ጋር የሚሰበሰበው ብር እነሱ ጋር መድረሱ ነው
thank you
so
thank you
ሃናዊ እሱ የሁላችንም ጎልስ ነው እሱን ነው የምናረጋው ግን ሌላ ደግሞ ቀልጠፍ ያለ አንድ መንገድም አለ እንነጋገርበትና ተጨማሪ ኦፕሽን ሊሆን ይችላል በማለት ነውና አንድ ስብሰባ ሴት እናረጋግና ከከባዱ ጋር እንወያያለንና እሱንም እንደ ኦፕሽን እንየው ለማለት ነው እንጂ የምታረጋግ የደከማችሁት ያላችሁ ጥረትን በእውነቱ ሁሉም እዚህ ያለው ሰው ሙሉ አፕሪሺየት ያደርጋል አብረናችሁ ያለ ነው በዚህም ደግሞ
thank you በጣም
thank you እሺ አሁን Ethiopian task force ይናገርና ከዛ በቃ እንዝጋው መሰለኝ አይደለም go ahead justice for Afar Ethiopian task force you can unmute yourself or somebody unmute them እጃቸው ወጥቷል
ሰላም ፍርዶስ ነኝ ከአትላንታ በጣም አመሰግናለሁኝ ብዙ ነገር ዲስከስ አርገናል ብዙ ትምርትም ተምረናል ብዙ ማናቀውንም አውቀናል በአፋሩ ጉዳይ እህቴ ሀድራ ጋር አብረን ነበር ይሄድነው ሁኔታውን እኔም አይቻለው ከዛ በኋላም ተመልሼ በግሌ ራሴ መስጠት ያለብኝን እርዳታ አድርሼን የመጣሁት በግሩፕ የሰጠነው ስላልደረሰ በጣም ቆጭቶኝ እና ያ ሁኔታዎች አሉና ነገሩን በጥሞና አስበንበት የሚደረገውን ነገር በደንብ ዲቴል በሆነ መንገድ ማድረግ ይኖርብናል እኔ አሁን መናገር የምፈልገው አትላንታ ላይ ባለው ሲቹዌሽን ነው ሁሉም እንዲያውቅልን የምንፈልገው ነገር ምንድነው አትላንታ በጣም ተከፋፍሏል በቁጥር ያለን ሰዎች ነን ብዙ ነገርን ለማካሄድ እየሞከርን ያለነው እንዳያችሁት ከስቴቱ ጋር ሆኖ ፕሬስ ሪሊዝ ሁሉ ተደርጓል ኢንተርኖችን አስገብተው እነሱ ናቸው ይሄን ሁሉ ነገር እንዲደርስ ያደረጉትና ነገሮቹ ደስ በማይል ሁኔታ ነው ያለው እና እዚህ ላይ እኔ በበኩሌ አምባሳደራችንንም ክሬ ነበረ ለምን ኢትዮጵያ ኮሚኒቲ ጋራ ብዙ እሱ ኢንፍሉዌንስ አለው እና ኢትዮጵያ ኮሚኒቲ ህዝቡን እንዲያሰባስብልንና ኤጁኬሽናል የሆነ ነገር ለመስጠትና ህዝቡን ለማሳወቅ ምክንያቱም ብዙ የተናደደ ሰው አለ አብረን ነበርን ዋሴ አዲስ አበባ እና እዛ ስብሰባ ላይ ሆነን ብዙ ነገሮች ተነጋግረናል ተናዶ የመጡ ግሩፖች አሉ እነሱ ናቸው አስተባብረው ህዝቡን እንዲያምጽ ያደረጉት እና ይሄ ሁሉ ነገሮችን ፌስ እያደረግን ስላለ እንደገና አሁን ምርጫ ኖቬምበር ላይ ስላለ ሴኔት ምርጫ አለ እሱንም ሁሉ የማደናቀፍ ሴራ እየተሰራ ነው ያለው በዛ በኩል እና ያ ሁሉ ሁኔታ እንዳይሳካ ለማድረግ የኢትዮጵያ ኮሚኒቲ ስራ አስኪያጆች ወይም አመራሮች በዚህ ነገር ላይ ብዙ አስተዋጽኦ መስራት ይችላሉ ተደማጭነት ስላላቸው በዛ ግሩፕ በአመጹት ግሩፖች ላይ ብዙ ተጽዕኖ ስላላቸውና እኔ ውጭ ጉዳይ ሚኒስቴር ድረስ ደውዬ አምባሳደሩ ላይ ፕሬሸር ተደርጎ እንዲያነጋግራቸው መንገድ እንዲፈለግ ሁሉ ዛሬ ጠይቄያለሁኝ ሰኞ ለታ እናነጋግረዋለን ብለዋል ይሄ ሲሪየስ የሆነ ጉዳይ በመሆኑና የናንተንም እርዳታ እንፈልጋለን ኤፓክም እዚህ እየሰራ ነው አትላንታ ከፕሮፌሰር ጋር እየሰራ ነው ዶክተር ኤባም አለበት ሁላችንም እንሞክራለን ግን እውነቱን ግልጹን ለመነጋገር አብዛኛው ወግኖ HR 6600 ይለፍ ብሎ ሽንጡን ይዞ የተከራከረ የሚሰራ ግሩፕ ነው ያለው አመሰግናለሁ
Thank you all right አሁን ደግሞ Ethiopian Eritrean rally against sanctions አለ Sunday April 10 እስከ 2 p.m. ይሄ ዋሽንግተን ዲሲ ነው እና ደግሞ ሎስ አንጀለስ ደግሞ በናይስ ራሊ ያለ against ብራድ ሸርመን በሰኞ በ11 ስለዚህ ላንች እያደረግን ነው እንትን ራሊዎቻችን ለሰው ሁሉ አሳውቁልን ካሊፎርኒያም ላሉ ዋሽንግተን ዲሲም ላሉ support these rallies. Okay, I think አሁን በቃ ጨርሰናል። በእኔ በኩል በጣም ነው የማመሰግነው። very enlightening በጣም ብዙ ትምህርት ራሴም ተምሬያለሁ። ብዙ ለሌሎችም እንትን እንደሰጠን እንዳስተማርንም ማለቴ ኤክስፐርቶቹ እንዳስተማሩ ይሰማኛል። I think በየጊዜው ይሄንን እየቀጠል ማድረግ ለሞራላችንም ጥሩ ነው። ለእንትኑ ብቻ ለትምህርቱ ለእውቀቱ ብቻ ሳይሆን እንደዚህ አይነት ኢትዮጵያኖች በየቦታው መኖራቸው በኃይል ደስ ይላል። እንግዲህ አሁን ሁላችንም ደጋግመን እንዳልነው we want to see action እና አሁን voter voiceም ሆነ ስልክም ሆነ ሁሉ ነገር ስፓይክ ሲያደርግ ማየት ነው የምንፈልገው በዚህ አኳያ እና ኦኬ አዩ መቼም ጓደኛዬ ስለሆነች አናግራታለሁ። go ahead.
Okay, Wasiye, thank you very much.
Discriminate አደርጋለሁ ነው ያይሽ በሽ
እኔ ቅድስት ሰፖርት ነው ማድረግ የነበረብን ግን we had it አንዳንዴ ቅድስት እንዳለችው መባል ያለበት ነገር መባል አለበት። ሰሞኑን ሁላችንም በየቦታው ዲስከሽን ነበረን። ስለተናደድኩኝ ብቻ አገሬ ላይ ሳት አለኩስም that is the part I don't understand እና ብዙ ጊዜ ዲስከሽን ካለኝ ሰዎች ጋር ሳንክሽኑን አንብቦት ሲባል አንብቦ የወሰኑ ሰዎች አሉ፣ ሳያነቡ የወሰኑ ሰዎች አሉ። እኔ ሳያነቡ ከወሰንኩት መካከል ነው መጀመሪያ because እንኳን አሁን ያለው መንግስት አይደለም TPLF ተመልሶ ቢመጣ ኢትዮጵያ ላይ ሳንክሽን አላረግም። ሳንክሽን የሚጠይቅ ጥያቄ አይደለም ለኔ። መደራጀት የፈለገ ይደራጅ፣ ኦርጋናይዝ ማድረግ ይደራጅ። it's not about ለኔ አሁን ያለው መንግስት ላይ ተናድጄ ሳንክሽን አረጋለሁ ማለት ኢትዮጵያን ዶክተር አብይ ብቻ ወይንም ብልጽግና ፓርቲ ብቻ አድርጎ እንዳሳነሷት ነው የምቆጥረው። ምክንያቱም that is not what it means. So ስለዚህ that is my point. Thank you very much for organizing this and thank you for coming, all of you.
በእውነቱ አዩ ያለችው ፖለቲካል ፓርቲ ይመጣል፣ ፖለቲካል ፓርቲ ይሄዳል፣ መንግስት ይመጣል፣ መንግስት ይሄዳልና ይሄ ባሁን ያለው ሁኔታ የሚያልፍ ስለሆነ ኢትዮጵያ ለዘላለም የምትኖርናት እሱ እንዳይ ፎከስ እናድርግ ነው። ትክክለኛ አባባል ነው። I think እንግዲህ ወደ 7 o'clock ሊሆን ነው 3 ሰዓት ነው የሰጣችሁን። በጣም እናመሰግናለን። ስብሰባውን የመራችሁ ባሲ as usual it was impeccable እና thank you for your leadership. የግሌን ክሩ ይሄንን ቴክኒካል ሰፖርት ያደረገው ግሩፕ ሁልጊዜም በጣም ድንቅ ስራ የሚሰሩ ግሩፖች ናችሁ። እናመሰግናለን እና all the speakers ሁሉም ዲስከሽን ላይ ፓርቲሲፔት ያደረጋችሁ በሙሉ በጣም እግዚአብሔር ይስጥልን። actionable እንሆን guys። 3 ሰዓት አውርተን ዝም ማለት ትርጉም የለውም። let's just get to action. Let's just make sure ስልኩ ይደወል። ለቤታ ብዙ ደብዳቤ ልካለን። ተባበሩ፣ ደብዳቤ ላኩ ስንል ፕሊስ ላኩ። በያሁን አትላንታ ወይዘሮ ፋርዶስ ያለችው ነገር የሚያሳዝን ነው። ግን አትላንታ ጠንካራ የሆነ የኦርጋናይዚንግ ኮሚቲ አለ። በተቻለ መጠን ኔሽን ዋይድ እናግዛቸው። እነሱ ብቻቸውን መሆን ማድረግ የሚችሉትን ያህል ያደርጋሉ። ግን ሁላችንም በየሌላው ስቴት ያለን ሰዎች በሙሉ እየደወልን እንተባበራቸው። ማድረግ የሚገባውን ነገር እናግዝ። እዛ የተቋቋመ ኮሚቴ አለ፣ እሱን እናጠናክረው። ብዙ ኮሚቴ ሌላ ማቋቋም የሚያስፈልግ አይደለም። እነሱን ካጠናከርነው ፎከስድ እንሆናለን። ፎከስ ስንሆን በደንብ ግብ መምታት እንችላለን እና ስለ ጊዜያችሁ እናመሰግናለን። የሚቀጥሉት ኔክስት አክሽን አይተምስ ላይ ያለውን ውጤት ፐብሊሽ እያደረግን እናሳውቃለን። መልካም ምሽት።
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.
Oh my God, he stopped it.